The wagon lurched through another rut, and Eliza's shoulder slammed against the wooden slat hard enough to leave a bruise. She didn't flinch, didn't give the driver the satisfaction of seeing her wince, just kept her eyes on the horizon where the mountains cut jagged teeth into a sky that looked like it was bleeding out. 3 days she'd been in this rattling coffin on wheels. 3 days since Marcus Brennan, the land baron who'd owned her father's debts, his farm, and apparently his daughter, had shaken hands with a stranger and sealed her future with the casual indifference of a man trading cattle. "You'll do well enough," Brennan had said, not even looking at her. "Rourke needs a wife. You need a roof. Seems fair." Fair. The words still tasted like rust and ashes. The driver hadn't spoken 10 words the entire journey, just chewed tobacco and spat over the side of the wagon, occasionally glancing back like he was transporting something that might spoil. Eliza didn't blame him. She probably looked half dead already. Hair matted with trail dust, dress stained with sweat, and God knew what else, eyes hollowed out from sleepless nights on hard ground. But she wasn't dead. Not even close. She'd spent those 3 days doing what she did best, watching, calculating, planning. The driver carried a rifle, but he was sloppy with it, let it slide around in the footwell like it was a walking stick. He drank from a flask every hour or so, just enough to dull his edges. And he was lazy, took the easy paths even when they added miles, avoided anything that looked like work, all useful information, all filed away in the part of her mind that had learned early and hard that survival wasn't about luck. It was about seeing the angles nobody else bothered to look for. The landscape had changed as they traveled west. The green hills of Brennan's territory, bought with blood and broken families, had given way to something harsher, drier, the kind of country that didn't forgive mistakes. Sparse vegetation clung to rocky soil like it was holding on by sheer stubbornness, and the few homesteads they passed looked like they were barely winning the same fight. This was the edge of things, where civilization frayed into something meaner. "There!" the driver said suddenly, his first word in hours. He pointed with his chin toward a cluster of buildings in the distance, shimmering in the heat like a mirage that might disappear if you looked too hard. Eliza leaned forward, ignoring the protest in her spine. The homestead was small, a cabin that had seen better decades, its roof sagging in the middle like a broken spine, a barn that looked like it was held together by habit and prayer, a few outbuildings that might have been a chicken coop, a smokehouse, maybe a tool shed, hard to tell from this distance, rail fencing that had more gaps than boards, and land, acres of it stretching toward the mountains, but it had that exhausted look that came from being worked too hard for too long without enough put back in. This was what she'd been sold for, this dying patch of frontier dirt. The wagon rolled to a stop in the yard, chickens scattering in a flurry of indignant squawking. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. The cabin door opened. The man who stepped out wasn't what Eliza had braced for. She'd built a picture in her head during the long ride, some grizzled old widower, or maybe a brutal drunk, or possibly one of those hollow-eyed men the frontier chewed up and spat out missing important pieces of their humanity. Caleb Rourke was none of those things. He was maybe 30, tall and lean in the way of men who worked hard but didn't eat enough. Dark hair that needed cutting, jaw shadowed with several days of beard, eyes that were some shade between gray and blue and gave away absolutely nothing. He wore work clothes that had been mended more than once, and his hands, she noticed hands always, were scarred and calloused, but steady. He looked at her the way you'd look at a problem you hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. "She's here," the driver announced, unnecessarily. "Brennan sends his regards." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind those unreadable eyes. Distaste, maybe, or resignation, hard to tell. "Fine," he said. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "Help her down." "That's extra," the driver said. Caleb just stared at him until the man shifted uncomfortably and looked away. Then he walked over to the wagon himself, held up a hand. Eliza ignored it. She stood on her own, gripping the side rail, and climbed down without assistance. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit solid ground. 3 days of sitting had turned her muscles to water, but she locked her knees and stayed upright through sheer willpower. She wouldn't fall. Not in front of this stranger she was supposed to call husband, not in front of anyone. Caleb watched her steady herself, and for just a second, something that might have been respect crossed his face. Or maybe she imagined it. "Your bag," the driver said, tossing a worn carpet bag into the dust at her feet without bothering to hand it down properly. Eliza picked it up without comment. Everything she owned in the world was in that bag, which meant everything she owned in the world could fit in 2 hands. The arithmetic of that didn't bear thinking about. "Brennan said to give you this." The driver handed Caleb a sealed envelope. "Said it's important you read it today." Caleb took the envelope like it might bite him, shoved it in his pocket without looking at it. The driver didn't wait for pleasantries, just turned the wagon in a wide arc, raising dust, and headed back the way they'd come. Within minutes, he was a shrinking speck on the horizon, and then he was gone entirely, leaving Eliza alone with her new husband in the middle of absolutely nowhere. The silence stretched. A hot wind kicked up, carrying the smell of dry grass and distance. Somewhere, a crow called out, harsh and mocking. "I don't need much," Eliza said finally, because someone had to say something. "A corner to sleep in. I'll work for my keep." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and she couldn't read a damn thing in his face. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "Neither did I." That seemed to land. His jaw tightened, and he nodded once, sharp. "Cabin's small. There's a room in back you can have. Water's from the well, buckets by the door. Outhouse is behind the barn. Don't go wandering after dark, there's animals that'll take you for prey." "Understood." He turned toward the cabin, then paused. "You got a first name, or should I just call you what Brennan called you?" "Eliza," she said. "Eliza Thorne." Caleb Rourke. He said it like she didn't already know, like they were strangers meeting on a street corner instead of 2 people legally bound together by a transaction neither of them wanted. "I know who you are," Eliza said. Something dark crossed his face at that. "I doubt it." Then he walked into the cabin and left her standing in the yard with her carpet bag and the hot sun bearing down and the slow creeping realization that this failing homestead at the ragged edge of nowhere, was her life now. She could break, could sit down in the dust and let the weight of it crush her, could cry or scream or curse the sky. But Eliza Thorne had learned a long time ago that breaking was a luxury she couldn't afford. So instead, she picked up her bag, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the cabin that was supposed to be her prison. She'd find the cracks in it. She always did. The inside of the cabin was dim after the harsh sunlight, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she cataloged everything with the same methodical attention she'd given the driver. One main room serving as kitchen, dining area, and sitting space all at once. A stone fireplace that looked like it worked, at least. Rough-hewn furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a bench. Shelves holding supplies, though not nearly enough of them. A doorway leading to what must be Caleb's room, and a smaller door in the back corner, slightly ajar. Her room, apparently. Caleb was at the table, the envelope from Brennan open in front of him. His face had gone hard, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. "Problem?" Eliza asked. He looked up, and for a second she saw past the careful nothing in his expression to something raw. Anger, frustration. Maybe fear, though he hid it quick. "Nothing that concerns you." "If it concerns this place, it concerns me. I live here now." "You don't live here," Caleb said flatly. "You're just staying until Brennan decides what to do with you next." The words hit like a slap, but Eliza had been hit before. She knew how to take the impact and keep standing. "What's in the letter?" "I said it doesn't concern you. And I'm saying if I'm going to survive whatever this is, I need to know what I'm up against." Caleb stared at her, and she stared right back. She'd learned young that men like him, men who'd been beaten down by circumstance and pride, would either respect strength or crush weakness. There was no middle ground. Finally, he shoved the letter across the table. "Read it yourself." Eliza set down her bag and picked up the single sheet of paper. The handwriting was elegant, almost mocking in its perfection. "Rourke. The outstanding balance on your land debt now stands at $847, due in full by October 15th. Failure to pay will result in foreclosure and seizure of all property and assets. Additionally, I'm sure you'll take excellent care of my investment. She's proven difficult in the past. I trust the frontier will teach her what civilization could not. Regards, Marcus Brennan." Eliza read it twice, her mind already turning over the numbers, the dates, the casual cruelty in every word. "How much do you have?" she asked. "What?" "Toward the debt. How much have you saved?" Caleb laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. "Maybe $30, if I'm lucky." "So you're short $817 with," she counted in her head, "4 months to find it." "Your arithmetic's real impressive. Doesn't change the fact that it's impossible." "Nothing's impossible," Eliza said. "Just improbable." "You always this optimistic?" "I'm not optimistic. I'm practical." She set the letter down, looked around the cabin again, this time with different eyes. "What do you produce here? What brings in cash?" "Nothing brings in cash," Caleb said. "I grow enough to eat, raise a few chickens for eggs, try to keep the livestock alive through winter. This isn't a profitable operation. It's a slow death with a roof over it." "Then why do you stay?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He stood abruptly, walked to the window, stared out at the land that was apparently trying to kill him by degrees. "It's mine," he said finally. "Only thing I've ever owned that was actually mine. My father broke his back on this land, and when he died, he left it to me. Not much of an inheritance, but it's what I got." "And Brennan?" "Loaned me money 3 years ago when a bad winter killed half my cattle. Seemed generous at the time. Didn't realize he was buying a noose to hang me with." Eliza nodded slowly. She'd seen this play before. Her own father had danced the same steps, borrowed from Brennan to cover one bad season, then found the interest climbing and the terms changing, and suddenly everything he'd built belonged to someone else. And when he couldn't pay, Brennan had taken her instead. "He does this on purpose," she said. "Sets the debt too high, makes the terms impossible, then takes everything when you can't meet them." Brilliant observation. "You want a medal for figuring out what everyone already knows?" "I want to not be part of his collection," Eliza shot back. "He sent me here as punishment, called me difficult like it's some kind of character flaw to object to being sold, but he made a mistake." "What mistake?" "He thought this would break me. Thought shipping me off to a dying homestead with a stranger would teach me my place." She met Caleb's eyes, held them. "But I've been broken before. Didn't take then, won't take now." Caleb studied her for a long moment, and she could practically see him trying to figure out if she was delusional or dangerous, or possibly both. "You think you can save this place?" he asked finally. "I think if we're both going to end up crushed under Brennan's boot anyway, we might as well make him work for it." Something almost like a smile tugged at the corner of Caleb's mouth. Almost. "You really are difficult, aren't you? You have no idea." That first night, Eliza learned the true dimensions of her new reality. The room Caleb had assigned her was barely bigger than a closet, with a narrow cot, a crate for her belongings, and a small window that didn't quite close all the way. The mattress was thin enough that she could feel every board beneath it, and the blanket smelled like mildew and old smoke. But it was hers. A door she could close, a space no one could take from her. She unpacked her carpet bag methodically. 2 dresses, both worn, a shawl, undergarments that had been mended so many times they were more thread than fabric, a hairbrush missing half its bristles, a small sewing kit, and wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth at the very bottom, a knife. Not a large knife, just a folding blade her mother had given her years ago, before the sickness took her. "Keep this close," her mother had whispered. "The world's not safe for women without sharp things." Eliza had kept it close ever since. She slid the knife under the thin mattress, within easy reach, then changed into her other dress and tried to make herself presentable. Failed mostly, but it was the effort that counted. When she emerged, Caleb was at the stove, doing something that might generously be called cooking. The smell wasn't promising. "I can do that," Eliza offered. "I've been feeding myself for 30 years. "And how's that been working out?" He glanced at her, then at the pan where something was burning, then back at her. "Fine," he said stubbornly. Eliza walked over, gently moved him aside. He was too surprised to resist, and took the pan off the heat before the contents became charcoal. She examined the ingredients he'd laid out: salt pork, some kind of beans, an onion that had seen better days. "You have any flour?" "Some." "Lard?" "Maybe." Then sit down and let me actually feed us before we both die of malnutrition." For a second, she thought he might argue, But then something in his posture changed, like a man recognizing when he was outmatched, and he moved to the table without another word. Eliza worked quickly, efficiently. The stove was temperamental, but she dealt with worse. She salvaged what she could of Caleb's attempt, added the onion and some dried herbs she found in a jar, started a batch of flatbread with the flour and lard. It wasn't fancy, but it was edible, and out here, edible counted as victory. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of utensils and the wind testing the cabin's walls. Eliza was hungrier than she'd realized. 3 days of hardtack and jerky had left her hollow, and she had to force herself to eat slowly, to not shovel food like an animal. "You cook like this often?" Caleb asked eventually. "Every day since I was 8. Someone had to, after my mother died." "Your father couldn't manage it?" "My father could manage a lot of things. Cooking wasn't one of them." She paused. "Running a farm without going into debt wasn't one of them either, apparently." Caleb nodded, understanding in the gesture. "Brennan got him too. Got him, bled him dry, then came for me when there was nothing left to take." She said it matter-of-factly, like reciting a weather report. "Told my father I could work off the debt. 3 years of labor," he said. "Seemed like the only choice." "And you believed him?" "I believed I didn't have options." She met his eyes across the table. "Turns out I was right, just not in the way I thought." Caleb pushed his empty plate away, leaned back in his chair. "Why'd he call you difficult?" Eliza smiled, but there wasn't any warmth in it. "I refused to stay in my place. Talked back, questioned his decisions, made it clear I wasn't going to be grateful for the privilege of servitude." Her voice hardened. "And when one of his men decided my contract included things that definitely weren't cooking or cleaning, I broke his nose with a shovel handle." The silence that followed was different than before, sharper. "He deserved it?" Caleb asked quietly. "He tried to put his hands on me in the barn. Said Brennan wouldn't care what he did as long as the work got done. So yes, he deserved it." "What happened after?" "Brennan had me locked in the cellar for 3 days. No food, no light. Said I needed to learn that violence had consequences." She paused. "Then he sold me to you. I guess that was the real consequence." Caleb was quiet for a long time, his face unreadable again. Then he stood, carried his plate to the wash basin, came back. "I'm not like that," he said. "Whatever you're worried about, whatever you think this arrangement means, I'm not going to touch you. You sleep in your room, I sleep in mine. We keep this business. That clear?" Eliza studied him, looking for the lie, the trap, the hidden angle. But all she saw was a tired man trying to draw a line between himself and Marcus Brennan. "Clear," she said. "Good." He moved toward his room, then stopped. "You did good with dinner. Better than I manage." It was probably the closest thing to a compliment she'd get, and Eliza found herself oddly grateful for it. "I'll handle the cooking from now on," she said. "You handle the rest." "Deal." Then he closed the door to his room, and Eliza was alone with the dying fire and the weight of everything that had happened in a single day. She cleaned up in silence, washed the dishes, banked the fire for the night. Through the thin walls, she could hear Caleb moving around, the creak of a bed taking his weight, then stillness. Outside, something howled in the distance. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters. And Eliza stood in the center of a cabin at the edge of the world, surrounded by failing land and impossible debt, and a future that looked like a slow slide into nothing, and made herself a promise. She would not be broken. She would not be crushed. She would not let Marcus Brennan have the satisfaction of watching her disappear into this harsh country like so many others before her. If she was going to go down, she'd take some pieces of him with her. The trick was figuring out how. The next morning started before dawn, announced by the sound of Caleb moving around in the dark. Eliza woke instantly. Years of sleeping light had taught her that, and lay still, listening to him dress, move through the cabin, head outside. She gave him 10 minutes, then rose herself. The cabin was cold, the fire down to embers. She rebuilt it efficiently, set water to heat, and was starting coffee when Caleb came back in carrying an armload of firewood. He stopped when he saw her, surprise clear on his face. "You're up." "So are you. I've got work to do." "So do I." She gestured at the coffee pot. "Give that a few minutes and there'll be something hot to drink." He set the wood down, brushed bark from his shirt. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to. She turned to face him directly. Look, we can dance around this all morning, or we can be practical. You said this place is dying. Fine, I'm here anyway. Might as well make myself useful. Caleb considered this, then nodded slowly. What do you know about farming? Enough. I grew up on a farm before my father mortgaged it into Brennan's pocket. I can plant, harvest, tend animals, mend fences. I can work. It's hard work, harder than you're probably used to. Eliza just looked at him until he had the grace to look away. Right, he said. Stupid thing to say? Little bit. The coffee was ready. She poured 2 cups, handed him one. He took it like a man accepting a peace offering, which maybe it was. Where do we start? She asked. Caleb drank half the cup in one long swallow, grimaced at the heat, swallowed anyway. Honestly, anywhere. Everything needs doing. The barn roof's got holes, the fence is falling down, the well's running shallow, the vegetable garden's barely producing, and half the chickens are old enough they've stopped laying. So we prioritize. We? Unless you're planning to lock me in the cabin, yes. We. He studied her over the rim of his cup, and she could see him trying to figure out if she was serious or delusional. Probably both, from his perspective. Fine, he said finally. But when you decide this is too much and want to go back to whatever easy life Brennan had you doing, don't expect me to feel sorry for you. I spent 3 years scrubbing floors, hauling water, washing other people's clothes, and dodging the hands of men who thought I came with the furniture, Eliza said evenly. Whatever you've got, I can handle it. Something shifted in his expression then. Not quite respect, but maybe the foundation of it. All right then, he said. Let's see what you're made of, us him. What followed was the hardest physical labor Eliza had done in her life, and she'd done plenty. They started with the barn roof because Caleb said the rain would be coming soon and the livestock needed shelter that didn't leak. He climbed up first, Eliza following with tools and materials, boards they couldn't really afford to replace but had to anyway, nails that were bent and reused because new ones cost money they didn't have. The work was brutal. Crawling around on the slanted roof in the growing heat, prying off rotted boards, fitting new ones, hammering until her arms shook. Her hands blistered within an hour, the soft skin of her palms splitting despite years of rough work. She didn't complain, didn't slow down, just kept moving, kept working, kept proving she meant what she said. Caleb noticed. She could tell by the way he stopped offering to take tools from her hands, stopped suggesting she rest. He just worked alongside her, steady and methodical, occasionally pointing out what needed doing, but otherwise letting her figure it out. By midday, they'd patched the worst of the holes. Not perfect, but functional. A temporary fix that might last a season if they were lucky. Good enough, Caleb said, climbing down. He moved like a man who hurt in places he'd stopped acknowledging, and Eliza understood that completely. She followed him down, her legs wobbling when her feet hit solid ground. Every muscle screamed. Her hands were a mess of broken blisters and splinters. Sweat had soaked through her dress, and she probably smelled like a barn animal. But they'd done it. Fixed something that was broken. Small victory, but she'd take it. There's stew left from last night, she said. We should eat. Caleb nodded, too tired to argue, and they walked back to the cabin in the kind of silence that comes from shared exhaustion. Inside, Eliza reheated the stew while Caleb washed up at the basin. They ate quickly, efficiently, fuel more than pleasure. Then Caleb stood, ready to head back out. What's next? Eliza asked. Fence line. Got a section down on the western edge. If the cattle get out, they're gone. Show me. They spent the afternoon digging post holes in ground that was more rock than soil, hauling rails that weighed more than Eliza did, wiring everything together into something that resembled a fence, if you squinted. Her back went from aching to numb to a kind of screaming agony that made breathing difficult. She didn't stop. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye, and she could practically see him recalculating whatever assumptions he'd made about her. She wasn't soft, wasn't weak, wasn't going to fold the first time things got difficult. You're bleeding, he said at one point, nodding toward her hands. She looked down. He was right. Blood mixed with dirt on her palms, seeping through the broken blisters. I'll live, she said, and went back to work. By the time the sun started its slow fall toward the mountains, they'd rebuilt 30 feet of fence. Not enough. Never enough. But progress. "That'll do for today," Caleb said, his voice rough with fatigue. Eliza just nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Every part of her hurt. She was fairly certain she'd done permanent damage to something important in her back. Her hands were ruined. But walking back to the cabin, covered in dirt and blood and sweat, she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Useful. Necessary. Like she was building towards something instead of just surviving. It wasn't much, but it was hers. That night, after another quiet meal and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that made thinking difficult, Eliza sat on her cot and tried to bandage her hands with strips torn from an old shirt. A knock on her door interrupted the attempt. "Yeah?" Caleb opened it partway, holding a small tin. "Salve," he said, "for the blisters." He set it on the crate that served as her table, then turned to leave. "Wait," Eliza said. "Why are you helping me?" He paused, his back to her. "Because you worked hard today. Harder than I expected. Seemed fair. You don't owe me anything." "I know." He glanced back, and in the low light, his face was different. Softer, maybe. Or just human. "But you didn't have to work like that. Could have stayed inside, made yourself scarce. Instead, you climbed on a roof and dug holes and bled into fence posts. That's worth something." Before she could respond, he left, closing the door quietly behind him. Eliza sat in the dim room, holding the tin of salve, and felt something crack in her chest. Not breaking, cracking. Like ice in spring, the first sign of thaw. She opened the tin, carefully spread the salve on her ruined hands, wrapped them as best she could. Then she lay down on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, listening to the night sounds of a frontier homestead. Cattle lowing in the distance, wind through gaps in the walls, the settling sounds of old wood, and underneath it all, the quiet breathing of a man on the other side of a thin door, just as trapped as she was, just as determined not to break. Maybe they'd both go down when Brennan came to collect, but Eliza was starting to think they might drag him into the pit with them. She fell asleep planning how. The days that followed developed a rhythm. Wake before dawn. Coffee and whatever breakfast could be managed quickly. Work until the sun was too high and hot to be outside, then tackle indoor tasks, repairs, cleaning, organizing supplies that were running dangerously low. Brief rest during the worst heat, then back outside until dark. Dinner, sleep, repeat. It was brutal, relentless, the kind of schedule that ground people down into dust. Eliza thrived on it. Every task she completed, every problem she solved, every improvement she made to the dying homestead, it all felt like warfare by other means. Brennan had sent her here to disappear, to be crushed by the weight of impossible circumstances. Instead, she was making herself indispensable. Caleb noticed. Of course he noticed. Hard not to when the cabin suddenly had actual meals instead of burned attempts at food, when the chickens started laying better because someone actually tended them properly, when the vegetable garden showed signs of recovery under systematic care. "You reorganized the pantry," he said one evening, staring at shelves that now made logical sense instead of looking like supplies had been thrown at them. "It was a mess. Couldn't find anything." "I could find things fine. You thought salt and flour were interchangeable. They're not." He opened his mouth, closed it, clearly couldn't argue the point. "It's better," he admitted finally. "More efficient." Eliza just nodded and went back to mending a shirt that had more holes than fabric. She'd found a basket of clothes that desperately needed repair, and since her hands were healing, might as well be productive. Caleb watched her work for a moment, something unreadable on his face. "You don't stop, do you?" "Stopping doesn't help anything. It helps you not collapse from exhaustion." She looked up, met his eyes. "I'll rest when we're not drowning. We might always be drowning. Then I guess I'll learn to work underwater." That almost smile flickered across his face again, gone before it could fully form. He sat down across from her, picked up another shirt from the basket without being asked. They mended clothes together in comfortable silence while the fire crackled and the night pressed against the windows. And if you didn't know better, you might think they were a normal couple doing normal things. But Eliza knew better. This wasn't normal. This was survival dressed up in domesticity. "Tell me about the debt," she said eventually. Caleb's hand stilled on the shirt. "What about it?" "The details. When did it start? How much was it originally? What's the interest rate? What are the actual terms?" "Why?" "Because I can't figure out how to fight something if I don't understand it." He set down the shirt, leaned back in his chair. "You really think there's a way to fight this?" "I think there's always a way. We just haven't found it yet." Caleb studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine. 3 years ago, bad winter killed most of my cattle. Lost about 80% of my stock. Couldn't recover without money. Couldn't get money from the bank. They wouldn't loan to someone already struggling. Then Brennan showed up, all friendly concern, offered to help." "How much?" $200. Seemed reasonable at the time. What, 10% interest due in 2 years. Eliza did the math in her head. "That should be $240, not $847. "Should be, yeah." His voice went hard. "But the contract had clauses. Penalties for late payment, fees for this and that, interest that compounds in ways I didn't understand when I signed. And whenever I managed to scrape together a payment, somehow it barely touched the principal. Just covered the interest and fees." He structured it to grow. He structured it to never be paid off. Caleb rubbed his face, looking older suddenly. "By the time I realized what I'd signed, it was too late. I'm trapped." "We're trapped," Eliza corrected. "He sold me into this same mess. You could leave. Could walk away from this dying pile of dirt and whatever contract Brennan forced on you." "Walk where?" "I don't have money, don't have family, don't have anywhere to go. And even if I did," she leaned forward, her voice intense. "Even if I did, I'm tired of running, tired of letting men like Brennan decide what happens to me. So no, I'm not leaving. I'm staying right here and making his life as difficult as he made mine." Caleb looked at her like he was seeing something he hadn't expected. "You really mean that?" "Every word. You're either the bravest person I've met or the most foolish." "Can I be both?" That pulled an actual smile from him, brief but real. "Fair point." Eliza picked up her mending again. "So we have 4 months to find $817 or lose everything. 4 months to find money that doesn't exist, yes. Then we need to think differently." She tied off a thread, bit it clean. "What assets do you have beyond land?" "Assets?" Caleb laughed bitterly. "You're looking at them. A falling down cabin, a barn that's held together by optimism, livestock that's barely worth butchering, and land that won't produce enough to matter. What about the land itself? Is there anything valuable on it?" "Like what? Gold?" He shook his head. "Trust me, if there was anything worth mining here, someone would have found it by now." "What about timber? Water rights? Anything?" "There's a stream on the northern edge, but it's seasonal, runs dry in summer, and the trees—" He paused, actually considering it. "There's some decent timber in the eastern section, pine mostly, but harvesting it would take equipment I don't have and labor I can't afford." Eliza filed that away. "What about crops? Could you grow something cash-worthy? Takes money to plant crops on that scale. Seed, equipment, irrigation, more than I have." "So you're saying every option requires money we don't have to make money we need?" "Now you're getting it." She refused to accept that. Refused to believe the trap was perfect. Every system had weaknesses. You just had to find them. "What does Brennan want most?" she asked. "What?" "From you, specifically. Why structure the debt this way instead of just foreclosing immediately? What's he getting out of dragging it out?" Caleb frowned, actually thinking about it. "I'm not sure. He's got plenty of land already. This place isn't worth much compared to his other holdings." "So it's not about the land itself." Eliza's mind was working now, turning over possibilities. "It's about something else. Control, maybe. Or just cruelty. Does it matter why? It might. If we understand what he actually wants, we might find leverage. The only leverage Brennan understands is money and power. We don't have either." "Not yet," Eliza said quietly. Caleb looked at her and she could see him trying to figure out if she was serious or delusional or possibly dangerous in ways he hadn't anticipated. "What are you planning?" he asked. "Nothing yet. But I'm thinking. She set aside the mended shirt, picked up another. And when I figure it out, you'll be the first to know. Boa sec. 2 weeks into her new life, Eliza made her first trip into town. Caleb needed supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Nails, salt, coffee. And though he clearly wasn't thrilled about bringing her along, he didn't have much choice. She'd made it clear she was coming whether he agreed or not. The town, if you could call it that, was called Ridgeline, a collection of weathered buildings squatting alongside a dusty main road like they were too tired to stand up straight. General store, saloon, blacksmith, a few other establishments that looked like they might blow away in a strong wind. And everywhere, the subtle signs of Brennan's influence. He owns half the buildings here, Caleb explained as they drove the wagon down the main street. General store, hotel, livery stable, and what he doesn't own outright, he's got money in. So he controls the town. He controls everything within 50 miles. Ridgeline's just the most obvious example. They pulled up in front of the general store, a 2-story building that was actually in decent repair, which told you everything you needed to know about who profited around here. Inside, the store was dimly lit and crammed with goods, farming equipment, dry goods, tools, fabrics, everything a frontier settlement might need, all priced just high enough to keep everyone perpetually in debt. The man behind the counter was middle-aged, balding, with the kind of calculating eyes that came from years of measuring people against their credit. "Caleb," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy, Frank." Frank's eyes slid to Eliza, taking in every detail. "Heard you got married. Congratulations." The word felt like an insult wrapped in politeness. "This is Eliza," Caleb said stiffly. "My wife." "Ma'am?" Frank nodded, still studying her. "You're the one Brennan sent over?" "I'm the one who lives at Caleb's homestead now," Eliza corrected, her voice pleasant but firm. "Whether Brennan sent me or not is irrelevant." Something flickered in Frank's expression. Surprise, maybe respect, hard to tell. "Fair enough," he said. "What can I do for you folks?" They went through the list, Caleb pulling items, Frank tallying prices. Eliza watched the numbers climb with growing concern. Everything cost more than it should, and she could see Frank padding the charges, adding pennies here and there that would be hard to dispute. "That'll be $9.40, Frank announced. "That's high," Eliza said. "Prices went up. Supply issues." "Prices went up, or your markup did?" Frank's expression hardened. "I don't set the prices, ma'am. I just follow what I'm told." "And who tells you?" The silence that followed was heavy with implication. "$9.40, Frank repeated. "You want the goods or not?" Caleb was already pulling out his thin wallet, counting out bills, but Eliza stopped him. "Add it to the account," she said. "Don't have an account here," Caleb muttered. "You do now." She turned to Frank. "Put it on Caleb Rourke's tab. We'll settle at the end of the month." "I'd need approval for that," Frank said carefully. "From who? Brennan?" Eliza smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Go ahead and ask him. Tell him Caleb's wife wants to establish credit. See what he says." It was a gamble, a huge one. But Eliza had read Brennan's letter carefully, had studied every word. He'd called her his investment, which meant, in his twisted logic, she had value, and value could be leveraged. Frank hesitated, clearly doing his own calculations, then nodded slowly. "Fine. But if Brennan says no, you pay cash next time." "Understood." They loaded the supplies into the wagon, Caleb moving with tight, angry efficiency. He didn't speak until they were out of town, halfway home. "What the hell was that?" "That was me buying us time," Eliza said. "By putting us further in debt, we were never going to pay cash for everything we need. The math doesn't work, so we use the credit they'll give us because Brennan thinks he owns us, and we use that time to figure out how to actually escape." "That's insane." "Maybe, but it's better than drowning slowly while pretending we can tread water." Caleb shook his head, hands tight on the reins. "You're going to get us both killed." "Probably," Eliza agreed. "But we'll die fighting instead of begging. That's worth something." He didn't answer, but she caught the smallest nod, like maybe, just maybe, he agreed. That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. Her body was exhausted enough, muscles aching from the day's work, but her mind wouldn't stop turning over the problem from every angle. $817. 4 months. No visible way forward. But there had to be something. Some angle, some weakness, some crack in Brennan's perfect trap. She rose quietly, pulled on her shawl, and slipped out of her room. The cabin was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace. She moved to the table, found the candle, lit it. Caleb's door opened. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, his voice rough. "Too much to think about." He came out in his work clothes, apparently having given up on sleep entirely, and sat across from her. "You're really not going to let this go, are you?" "Would you, if you were me?" He considered that. "No, probably not." "Then stop acting like I'm crazy for fighting." "I don't think you're crazy." He paused. "Dangerous, maybe. Reckless, definitely. But not crazy." "I'll take it." They sat in silence for a moment, the candle flickering between them. "What if we can't win?" Caleb asked quietly. "What if there's no way out and we're just delaying the inevitable?" "Then we delay it as long as possible," Eliza said, "and we make sure Brennan knows he didn't break us. That matters." "Does it?" "To me it does." She looked at him directly. "I've been powerless my whole life. Watched my mother die because we couldn't afford medicine. Watched my father drink himself into debt. Was sold like property to pay for his mistakes. I'm tired of being something that happens to instead of someone who makes things happen." Caleb nodded slowly. "I get that, more than you know." "Then help me," Eliza said. "Really help me. Not just tolerate me being here, but actually work with me to find a way out." "I don't know how." "Neither do I. But two people thinking is better than one." He studied her for a long moment, candlelight casting shadows across his face, making him look younger and older at the same time. "All right," he said finally. "We fight, together. Whatever that means." Eliza felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she hadn't realized she was carrying. "Together," she agreed. And in that moment, sitting at a battered table in a dying cabin at the edge of nowhere, two people who'd been sold and trapped and crushed by circumstances made a pact. They would fight. They would struggle. They would probably lose, but they'd do it together, and they'd make Marcus Brennan earn every inch of ground he took from them. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was theirs. And for Eliza Thorne, who'd been someone else's property for so long she'd almost forgotten what freedom felt like, that was enough. For now. The next morning brought rain, the kind that started as a whisper against the roof and built into a steady drumming that made conversation difficult. Eliza stood at the window watching water pour off the eaves in sheets, turning the yard into a muddy morass. "Well," Caleb said from behind her, "at least we fixed the barn roof when we did." "It's small mercies." She turned to face him. "What do we do on days like this?" "Indoor work, maintenance, repairs." He gestured at the cabin around them. "Always something that needs fixing." They spent the morning doing exactly that. Caleb working on a door that had started to stick, Eliza going through their supplies and making careful notes of what they had, what they needed, what they could stretch further than it was meant to go. The numbers were worse than she'd thought. "Caleb," she called out, "when did you last buy flour?" 2 months ago, maybe. "Why?" "Because at the rate we're using it, we'll be out in 3 weeks. He looked up from the door, concern flickering across his face. "Can we make it stretch?" "We can try, but we'll need to supplement somehow. Hunt more, fish if the creek's running, maybe trade with neighbors if you have any." "Nearest neighbor's the Carlsons, about 8 miles east. They're struggling same as us." "Everyone out here struggling the same way?" Caleb nodded grimly. "That's what Brennan does. Keeps everyone just desperate enough that we can't help each other. We're all too busy trying to survive to organize." Eliza wrote that down in her mental ledger, another piece of the pattern. Brennan didn't just exploit individuals. He'd built a system that kept entire communities fragmented and powerless. "The Carlsons," she said slowly. "They owe Brennan too?" "Most people do, one way or another. Why?" "Just thinking." She went back to her inventory, but her mind was elsewhere now, turning over an idea that was probably stupid, but wouldn't leave her alone. The rain continued through lunch, cold beans and the last of yesterday's bread, and into the afternoon. By evening, the steady downpour had settled into something almost hypnotic, and Eliza found herself sitting by the fire with one of Caleb's books, trying to read by firelight while he worked on repairing a harness. You read much? He asked, breaking the comfortable silence. When I can. My mother taught me before she died. Said education was the one thing nobody could take from you. She paused. Turns out that's not quite true. Hard to read when you're working 16-hour days. What's the book? She held it up. Something about agricultural techniques. Thought it might have useful information. Does it? Mostly tells me things I already know, just in fancier words. She set it aside. We need to talk about the Carlsons. Caleb's hands stilled on the harness. What about them? How well do you know them? Well enough? Thomas Carlson and I helped each other with harvests a few times before things got too bad. His wife marries decent people. They've got 3 kids, all young. And their debt situation? Bad. Maybe worse than ours. Thomas tried to expand his operation 2 years back, borrowed heavy from Brennan. Didn't work out. Eliza leaned forward. What if we talked to them? Compared notes? Figured out exactly how Brennan structured all these debts? To what end? To find a pattern, a weakness. She could see Caleb's skepticism and pushed forward anyway. Look, Brennan's not stupid. He's systematic. He has to be, to run an operation this size. Which means there are probably similarities in how he traps people. And if there are similarities, there might be vulnerabilities. That's a lot of might be's. You have a better idea? Caleb set down the harness, rubbed his face. No, but reaching out to the Carlsons, asking them to share their financial details, that's risky. What if they're closer to Brennan than I think? What if they report back? Then we're no worse off than we already are. Brennan already knows we're here, already knows the debt situation. What's he going to do, make it worse? He could do a lot of things to make it worse, and you know it. Eliza did know it, but she also knew that doing nothing was just a slower version of the same ending. I think it's worth the risk, she said quietly. Caleb studied her for a long moment, firelight casting shadows across his face, making it hard to read his expression. You really don't give up, do you? Haven't found a reason to yet. He shook his head, but there was something almost like admiration in the gesture. Fine. When the rain stops, we'll ride out to the Carlsons. But if this goes wrong, it's on you. Fair enough. The rain finally broke 2 days later, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth. Caleb hitched up the wagon while Eliza packed supplies. Nothing fancy, just some eggs and preserves, the kind of gifts you brought when visiting neighbors who were as poor as you were. The ride to the Carlson homestead took most of the morning, the wagon struggling through mud that tried to suck the wheels down with every rotation. Eliza used the time to study the landscape, taking in the other homesteads they passed, all showing the same signs of stress and slow failure that marked Caleb's place. It's all like this? She asked. For miles. Brennan owns the good land, leases out the marginal stuff at rates that guarantee failure. Then he forecloses and adds it to his holdings. How long's he been doing this? 10 years? Maybe longer. Started small, buying up foreclosures during bad seasons. Now he's got half the county locked down. And nobody's challenged him. Caleb laughed bitterly. With what? Money for lawyers, political connections. Brennan owns the sheriff, has judges in his pocket, controls most of the local economy. You don't challenge a man like that and win. Somebody must have tried. A few. They're not around anymore. Eliza filed that away. Another piece of the larger picture. The Carlson place appeared through the trees, and it was immediately clear they were in worse shape than Caleb. The cabin was smaller, shabbier, and the fields looked like they'd been neglected for at least a season. A few scraggly chickens picked at the dirt, and a milk cow stared at them with the blank exhaustion of an animal that wasn't getting fed enough. Thomas Carlson emerged from the cabin as they pulled up, a thin man in his 40s, worn down by hard living, eyes that had seen too many failures. Behind him, his wife Mary appeared, younger, but just as tired, wiping her hands on an apron that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Caleb, Thomas said, surprise and caution mixing in his voice. Didn't expect to see you. Thomas, Mary. Caleb climbed down from the wagon, helped Eliza down. This is my wife, Eliza. Mary's eyes widened slightly. Heard you'd gotten married. Welcome. The word didn't sound particularly welcoming, but Eliza couldn't blame her. Unexpected visitors usually meant bad news. We brought some things, Eliza said, retrieving the basket. Just neighbors helping neighbors. Mary took the basket hesitantly, peered inside, and something shifted in her expression. That's kind of you. We've been a bit short on eggs. Kids around? Caleb asked. Playing in back. I'll call them if you want. Let them play. We actually came to talk to you and Thomas. Adult conversation. The caution in Thomas's eyes deepened, but he gestured toward the cabin. Come on in, then. Inside was cramped and sparse, furniture that looked homemade and not well, walls that needed chinking, a general air of things falling apart faster than they could be fixed. 3 small faces peered around a doorway, the children, curious about the strangers. Go play outside, Mary told them gently, and they scattered. They sat around a table that wobbled on uneven legs, and an awkward silence settled over the group. So, Thomas said finally, what's this about? Caleb glanced at Eliza, and she took it as her cue. We're trying to figure out if there's any way to deal with Marcus Brennan that doesn't end in foreclosure, she said bluntly. And we thought maybe if we compared situations, we might find something useful. Thomas and Mary exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Fear, hope, suspicion all mixed together. That's dangerous talk, Thomas said quietly. Living out here's dangerous anyway, Eliza countered. Might as well be dangerous with purpose. Mary surprised them by laughing, short and sharp. She's got you there, Thomas. Mary, no, she's right. We're dying slow anyway. What's it hurt to talk? Thomas rubbed his face, looking older suddenly. Fine. What do you want to know? Over the next hour, they laid out their respective situations, and the pattern Eliza had suspected became brutally clear. Brennan used the same playbook every time. Offer reasonable loans during crises, bury impossible terms in complex contracts, use penalties and compounding interest to ensure the debt only grew, then foreclose when the victim couldn't pay. He loaned us $300 2 years ago, Thomas said. Now we owe over $1,000. The math doesn't even make sense, but it's all there in the contract, legal as anything. Same structure as ours, Caleb confirmed. Different amounts, same trap. It's not just the debt either, Mary added. He controls the general store, so prices are always just high enough to keep us from getting ahead. And when we try to sell anything, crops, livestock, somehow Brennan's operations are always buying at the lowest price. Vertical integration, Eliza murmured. What? He controls every part of the system. Production, distribution, retail. We can't escape because there's nowhere to escape to. The room fell silent as that truth settled over them. So what do we do? Mary asked, and there was something desperate in her voice. Just wait for him to take everything? That's what I've been doing, Thomas said bitterly, waiting for the inevitable. There has to be another way, Eliza insisted. Systems have weaknesses. We just need to find them. You sound awfully confident for someone who just got here, Thomas said, not unkindly. No offense, but what makes you think you can figure out something nobody else has? Because I'm not from here. I see it differently. Eliza leaned forward. You've all been in this so long you can't see it clearly anymore. But I'm looking at it fresh, and I'm telling you, there's something we're missing. Like what? I don't know yet, but... She paused, an idea forming. What if we got more information? Talked to other families in debt to Brennan, documented everything, looked for patterns across all of it? That would take time we don't have, Caleb pointed out. It would also put a target on everyone involved, Thomas added. Brennan finds out people are organizing against him. He'll crack down hard. He's already cracking down, Mary said quietly. Just slower. Maybe fast is better. Mary, I mean it, Thomas. I'm tired of watching you kill yourself for nothing. If there's even a chance this could work, shouldn't we try? The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impossible choices. Finally, Thomas nodded slowly. All right. We'll help, but carefully. We've got kids to think about. Carefully, Eliza agreed. We document everything, share information, look for leverage, and we keep it quiet until we have something solid. They spent another hour working out details. Who else might be willing to talk? How to approach them? What information they needed to gather? By the time Caleb and Eliza climbed back into the wagon, the sun was past its peak and heading toward the mountains. That went better than I expected, Caleb admitted as they started the long ride home. They're desperate. Desperate people take risks. We're all desperate out here. Question is whether desperation makes us brave or stupid. Maybe both, Eliza said. Maybe that's what it takes. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking, the horses plodding through drying mud. Eliza's mind was already working ahead, planning next steps, calculating angles. You know this probably won't work, Caleb said eventually. Probably not. And we could make things worse. We could. But you're going to do it anyway. Yes. He shook his head, but she caught the smallest smile tugging at his mouth. You're going to get us all killed or make us legends. Not sure which. I'll settle for just surviving with some dignity intact. That's not how Brennan works. He doesn't leave room for dignity. Then we'll have to take it back from him. The wagon hit a rut, jolting them both, and Eliza grabbed the rail to steady herself. Her hands had healed some in the past weeks, the blisters turning to calluses, the softness she'd arrived with replaced by something harder. She was changing. She could feel it. The frontier was filing down her edges, turning her into something sharper, more dangerous. Less the property Brennan thought he'd disposed of, and more like a blade he'd accidentally helped forge. By the time they got home, exhaustion had settled deep into both of them. They unhitched the wagon in comfortable silence, tended the animals, moved through evening chores with the efficiency of people who'd developed a rhythm without realizing it. Over dinner, venison stew that Eliza had figured out how to make actually taste good, Caleb brought up something that had clearly been bothering him. What you said to the Carlsons about seeing things fresh, you really think that's an advantage? I do. You've all been living in this so long you accept it as normal. But it's not normal. It's calculated exploitation dressed up as business. That's a fancy way of saying we're all getting robbed. We are getting robbed, but systematically, which means there's a system to understand and potentially disrupt. Caleb set down his spoon. You talk like you've done this before. Done what? Fought powerful men, looked for weaknesses in systems. Eliza hesitated, then decided honesty was simpler. I spent 3 years watching Brennan operate, learned how he thinks, how he structures things, what matters to him. Wasn't planning to use that knowledge, but turns out observation's a useful skill. You were studying him. I was surviving. Studying was just part of it. And what'd you learn? That he's methodical, almost obsessive about documentation and legal cover. Everything he does has paperwork backing it up, contracts and deeds and agreements. He doesn't take risks. He engineers certainty. How's that a weakness? Because systems that rely on documentation can be undermined by documentation. If we can prove his contracts are fraudulent, if we can show a pattern of deliberate exploitation, if we can get evidence into the right hands being who? The sheriff works for him. The judges are bought. Who exactly are you planning to appeal to? Eliza didn't have an answer for that yet, and Caleb could see it. You're making this up as you go, he said. Mostly, yes. And you think that's enough? I think it's better than giving up. Caleb studied her across the table, firelight casting shadows between them, and she couldn't quite read his expression. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled, really smiled, for the first time since she'd arrived. You're either the most stubborn person I've ever met, or the most foolish. You said that already, bears repeating. But there was warmth in his voice now, something that hadn't been there before. All right, we try it your way. Document everything, talk to people, look for patterns, and when Brennan inevitably crushes us for it, at least we'll have tried. That's the spirit. That's resignation dressed up as optimism. I'll take it. They finished dinner in comfortable silence, and afterward, while Caleb tended the fire, Eliza pulled out the paper and pencil she'd found in the cabin's sparse supplies and started making notes. Everything they'd learned from the Carlsons, the structure of the debts, the timeline of foreclosures, the pattern of control over local commerce. She wrote until her hand cramped, documenting every detail she could remember. What are you doing? Caleb asked, looking over her shoulder. Building a case, even if we don't know who we're presenting it to yet. You really think like this all the time? Like what? Strategically. Like everything's a puzzle to solve. Eliza considered that. I think like someone who's been powerless most of her life and is tired of it. If that means treating problems like puzzles, then yes. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Your mother really taught you to read? Every night before bed. Said words were power, and power was the only thing that mattered. Was she right? She died anyway, so I'm not sure. But the reading stuck. And your father? Eliza's hand stilled on the paper. What about him? You don't talk about him much. Not much to say. He was broken after my mother died. Drank, made bad decisions, borrowed money he couldn't repay. When Brennan came to collect, he handed me over like I was livestock and drank himself to death 6 months later. I'm sorry. Don't be. He made his choices. She went back to writing. I'm making mine. The scratch of pencil on paper filled the silence, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the settling sounds of the old cabin. Outside, night creatures called to each other, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. This was her life now. A dying homestead, impossible debt, a man she barely knew who she was legally bound to, and a plan that probably wouldn't work. But it was hers to fight for, and that meant something. The next few weeks fell into a pattern of brutal work and careful planning. During the day, they fought to keep the homestead functioning. Repairs, planting, tending animals, all the endless labor that farming required. At night, Eliza worked on her documentation, while Caleb started reaching out carefully to other struggling farmers, feeling out who might be willing to share information. It was slow going. People were scared, suspicious, worn down by years of exploitation. But gradually, a few started to talk. The Hendersons, 3 miles south, who'd lost their land to Brennan 2 years ago and now worked as tenant farmers on property they used to own. Old Jacob Morrison, who'd been fighting Brennan's debt collectors for 5 years and had a stack of threatening letters that documented escalating harassment. The widow Chen, whose husband had died in an accident shortly after threatening to go to federal authorities about Brennan's practices. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle, and the picture that emerged was uglier than even Eliza had anticipated. He's been doing this for at least 15 years, she told Caleb one night, surrounded by papers covered in her careful handwriting. Started small, targeting individuals, evolved into a systematic operation that controls almost everything in the region. How many families has he destroyed? At least 30 that we know of, probably more. Caleb swore quietly. And nobody's stopped him. Nobody's been able to. He's too well protected, too well connected. The local authorities are either bought or intimidated. So what do we do with all this information? That was the question that kept Eliza up at night. They were building a damning case against Marcus Brennan, but a case was useless without someone to present it to. We need to go higher, she said finally. Past the local authorities to somewhere Brennan doesn't control. Like where? The territorial governor? Federal marshals? Maybe. I need to research more, figure out who has jurisdiction and authority and can't be bought. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we survive. Keep the homestead running, keep gathering information, and hope we figure it out before the foreclosure deadline, which was coming faster than either of them wanted to acknowledge. They were down to 8 weeks now, and despite working themselves nearly to death, they'd barely scraped together another $40 toward the debt. The math was impossible. They both knew it, but neither of them said it out loud. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of trying to fix a collapsed section of irrigation ditch, Eliza found herself too exhausted even to think strategically. She just sat by the fire, staring at the flames, feeling the weight of everything pressing down. Caleb emerged from his room with a bottle of whiskey, 2 cups. Where did that come from? She asked. Been saving it. Seemed like tonight's a good night to drink it. He poured 2 generous measures, handed her one. Eliza took it, sniffed it, made a face. Not a whiskey drinker? Caleb asked. Never really had the chance to develop the taste. Fair enough. He raised his cup. To terrible decisions and the stubborn people who make them. Eliza laughed despite herself and raised her own cup. I'll drink to that. The whiskey burned going down, harsh and unforgiving, but it spread warmth through her chest that she hadn't realized she needed. They sat in silence for a while, passing the bottle back and forth, the alcohol slowly softening the hard edges of the day. Can I ask you something? Caleb said eventually. Sure. Why are you really doing this? Fighting Brennan, I mean. You could have just accepted it. Made the best of a bad situation. But you're risking everything on a plan that probably won't work. Why? Eliza took another drink, considering her answer. Because I'm tired of men like him deciding what happens to people like us. Tired of being powerless. Tired of watching the same pattern repeat. The strong crush the weak, and everyone pretends that's just how things are. That is how things are. Only because we let it be. She turned to face him. What if we didn't? What if enough people said no at the same time, refused to play by rules designed to destroy us? What if we fought back? We'd lose. Probably. But at least we'd have tried. At least we'd have stood up. Caleb shook his head, but he was smiling. You really are crazy. So you keep saying. And yet here I am, going along with it. What's that make you? Just as crazy, I guess. They both laughed at that, the sound strange and light in the heavy cabin. And for just a moment, the impossible weight of their situation felt bearable. You want to know something? Caleb said, his words slightly slurred by whiskey. When Brennan's man delivered you here, I thought my life was over. Thought he was just twisting the knife, sending me someone else to watch suffer when I couldn't save myself. And now? Now I think maybe you're the best thing that's happened to this place in years. You've got more fight in you than this entire county combined. The compliment hit harder than Eliza expected, warming her more than the whiskey had. I'm just doing what needs doing, she said quietly. No, you're doing what everyone else was too scared or broken to try. That's different. They finished the bottle in comfortable silence, and when Eliza finally stood to head to her room, she swayed slightly, the alcohol making her movements uncertain. Caleb steadied her with a hand on her elbow, and for just a second they were close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes in the firelight, gray-blue with flecks of something darker. Thank you, she said. For what? For not giving up, for letting me try. Don't thank me yet. We might both regret this. Probably. But at least we'll regret it together. She went to her room then, closing the door softly, and lay down on the thin mattress still fully dressed. The cabin spun slightly, and she closed her eyes, willing the world to settle. But even through the alcohol haze, her mind was working, always working, turning over the problem from every angle. They needed leverage. Real leverage, not just documented complaints. Something that would force Brennan to negotiate or face consequences he couldn't control. She just had to figure out what that something was. Tomorrow. She'd think about it tomorrow. Tonight, she'd let the whiskey and exhaustion pull her under, and for once, she'd try not to dream about debt and deadlines and the slow, crushing weight of impossible odds. But sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace. Just fragments of memory and fear, her father's hollow eyes, Brennan's cold smile, the sound of a wagon carrying her away from everything she'd known toward a future that looked like a noose. She woke before dawn, head pounding, mouth dry, and found Caleb already up, moving quietly through morning chores. Coffee's ready, he said, not looking at her. You're a saint. Just someone who's been hung over before. They didn't talk about the previous night, just moved through their routines, swallowed coffee and aspirin, and prepared for another day of work that would never be enough. But something had shifted between them. Some wall had come down in the whiskey-fueled honesty, and now they moved around each other differently, less like strangers bound by circumstance and more like partners in a shared struggle. It was a small change. Subtle. But Eliza felt it in the way Caleb handed her tools without her asking, the way he waited for her input before making decisions, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. Like she mattered, like her presence was worth something beyond whatever transaction Brennan had engineered. And that, more than any strategic planning, gave her the strength to keep fighting. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday, 6 weeks before the foreclosure deadline, in the most unlikely way possible. Eliza was in town picking up supplies. They'd established enough credit that Frank at the general store no longer questioned her orders when she overheard two men talking near the back of the store. They didn't notice her behind the fabric display, and their voices carried clearly in the quiet afternoon. Brennan's getting nervous, one said, voice low. All these families starting to compare notes, talk to each other. He doesn't like it. What's he going to do about it? What he always does. Apply pressure. I heard he's sending collectors out early to some of the farms, demanding immediate payment, even though the contracts say October. That legal? Who's going to stop him? Sheriff won't touch it, and the judge owes Brennan 3 favors and a mortgage. They moved away then, their conversation fading, but Eliza stood frozen behind the fabric bolts, her mind racing. Brennan was worried. Worried enough to break his own contracts, to push harder than his carefully constructed legal framework allowed, which meant their quiet organizing was having an effect, making him nervous enough to make mistakes. And mistakes could be exploited. She finished her shopping quickly, loaded the wagon, and drove home faster than was probably safe, her thoughts churning the entire way. Caleb was in the barn when she arrived, and she practically ran to find him. "He's scared," she said without preamble. Caleb looked up from the horse he was brushing. "What?" "Brennan. He's scared. I overheard his men talking. He's worried about people comparing notes, and he's breaking his own contract terms by demanding early payment. How's that help us?" "Because it means we're getting to him. And because if he's violating his own contracts, that's evidence. Real, actionable evidence." Caleb set down the brush, his expression shifting from confusion to interest. "You think we can use that?" "I think if we can document it, get witnesses, maybe even get copies of the contracts with the actual dates versus when he's demanding payment, we might have something that even a bought judge would have trouble ignoring." "That's a lot of ifs." "Everything's been ifs so far. At least these are new ifs." Caleb wiped his hands on his pants, thinking. "Who'd he send collectors to?" "They didn't say names, but we could find out, ask around, see who's been pressured recently. And if we find them, we convince them to document everything, every conversation, every threat, every deviation from the written contract. We build a case so solid that even Brennan's connections can't make it disappear." For a long moment, Caleb just looked at her, and she could see him weighing risks against possibilities, fear against hope. "You know this makes us a direct threat to him," he said finally. "Not just annoying, actual threat." "Good. Maybe he'll make more mistakes. Or maybe he'll destroy us before we can use what we find. He's going to destroy us anyway. The foreclosure date's in 6 weeks. We don't have the money, and we're not going to get it. So we either go down quiet or we go down fighting loud enough that people notice." Caleb shook his head, but he was smiling that half smile that meant he thought she was crazy, but was going to follow her anyway. "All right. We start asking questions, but careful, yeah? No point gathering evidence if we're dead before we can use it." "Careful as," Eliza agreed, though they both knew careful wasn't really her style. Over the next week, they quietly reached out to the network they'd been building. Thomas Carlson helped, his desperation overcoming his natural caution. Mary Chen, the widow, provided names of others who'd been targeted. Even old Jacob Morrison, who'd been fighting Brennan longer than anyone, offered what information he had. And a picture emerged that was damning in its clarity. Brennan had sent collectors to at least 7 families in the past month, all demanding immediate payment despite contracts that gave them until October or later. Some had been threatened with violence. Others had been told their property would be seized immediately if they didn't comply. All of it was outside the legal framework Brennan had so carefully constructed. "He's panicking," Eliza said, surrounded by papers in the cabin one night. "Systematic exploitation works when it's quiet and legal. But this is just thuggery. And thuggery leaves evidence. Evidence we still don't know what to do with," Caleb pointed out. "I've been thinking about that." Eliza pulled out a map she'd been working on, crude but functional. "Brennan controls everything local. Sheriff, judges, most of the merchants. But his control only extends so far. Past county lines, he's just another landowner." So we take the evidence outside his territory. Federal authorities, territorial governor, maybe even newspapers in the capital. Someone who doesn't owe him anything and might actually care about systematic fraud. Caleb studied the map. "That's a 4-day ride at least. And we can't both go. Someone needs to stay with the homestead." "I'll go," Eliza said immediately. "Like hell you will. You're a woman traveling alone through rough country. That's asking for trouble. And you're needed here. The animals won't tend themselves, and if both of us disappear, Brennan will know something's up." They stared at each other across the table, neither willing to budge. "We could wait," Caleb suggested. "Find someone else to take the evidence." "Who? Everyone here is either too scared or too compromised. It has to be one of us." "Then it should be me. I can handle the ride, and I've got contacts in the capital from before my father died." "Contacts Brennan might know about. I'm nobody to him. Just property he threw away. He won't be watching me." "That's exactly why you shouldn't go. You're vulnerable out there." Eliza felt frustration rising. "I'm vulnerable everywhere. At least if I'm moving, I'm doing something. The argument continued for another hour, neither of them willing to concede, until finally Mary Carlson settled it for them. She arrived the next morning unexpected, with information that changed everything. "Brennan's planning something," she said, breathless from the ride. "Thomas heard it from one of the workers at Brennan's estate. There's going to be a gathering of all the debt holders in 2 weeks. Some kind of renegotiation meeting." Renegotiation? Caleb's voice was heavy with skepticism. "That's what they're calling it, but Thomas thinks it's a trap. Get everyone in one place, make them sign new terms that are even worse, use the crowd to pressure holdouts." Eliza's mind was already racing ahead. When exactly? 2 weeks from Saturday at Brennan's estate. And he's requiring everyone to attend? Not requiring, but strongly suggesting. Said anyone who doesn't show up will have their debt called in immediately. Eliza looked at Caleb, and she could see he was thinking the same thing she was. "That's our window," she said. "Window for what?" "To get into his estate. While he's got everyone gathered for this meeting, his attention will be divided. Security will be focused on the crowd, not on what's happening inside." Caleb's eyes widened. "You want to break into Brennan's estate?" "I want to find the original contracts, the real documents, not the copies he's given out. If they're different, if he's been altering terms or forging signatures, that's fraud. Real, provable fraud." "That's insane." "That's evidence that could actually matter." Mary looked between them. "You're talking about stealing from Marcus Brennan." "I'm talking about taking back what he stole from us," Eliza corrected. "Every one of those contracts represents a family he's destroyed. If we can prove he did it illegally, we might be able to save what's left." "Might" being the critical word, Caleb said. "This is dangerous, Eliza. Not theoretical dangerous. Actually dangerous. If I get caught, I'm no worse off than I already am. He already owns me, remember? What's he going to do, sell me twice?" The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither of them wanted to examine too closely. Finally, Mary spoke. "If you're really doing this, you'll need help. Someone who knows the estate layout." "You know it?" Eliza asked. "I worked there for 6 months before I married my husband, kitchen staff. I know where Brennan keeps his office, where the documents would be stored, and I know the patterns of the household, when staff rotate, where guards are posted." "Why would you help us?" Mary's face hardened. "Because Brennan had my husband killed. Called it an accident, but I know better. He was asking questions, talking to people, doing exactly what you're doing now. 3 days later, he fell off a roof he'd climbed 100 times before. So yes, I'll help. I want that bastard to pay." Eliza felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't just about debt anymore. It was about justice for people who'd been crushed by a system designed to destroy them. "All right," she said. "Then we plan this right. We've got 2 weeks to figure out how to get in, what we're looking for, and how to get out without getting caught or killed." "This is crazy," Caleb said again, but there was resignation in his voice now. Acceptance that once Eliza set her mind to something, momentum became inevitable. "Completely crazy," Eliza agreed, "but it might be our only shot." The next 2 weeks were a blur of planning and preparation. Mary drew detailed maps of the estate from memory, marking guard posts and servant corridors, and the location of Brennan's private office. Thomas scouted the perimeter, noting weak points in the fence line and gaps in patrol routes. Old Jacob Morrison contributed what he knew about Brennan's security measures from years of observation. And Eliza studied it all, memorizing every detail, planning every step of an infiltration that probably wouldn't work, but had to be tried anyway. Caleb watched her with increasing concern, occasionally trying to talk her out of it, but mostly just helping despite his better judgment. "You know you're probably going to die doing this," he said one night, watching her trace routes on Mary's maps for the 100th time. "Probably." "And that doesn't bother you?" "Of course it bothers me. But dying trying is better than dying broken." He was quiet for a moment. "When did you get so fearless?" "I'm not fearless. I'm terrified. But I'm more angry than scared, and anger makes you do stupid things. Anger gets you killed. So does submission. At least anger feels like living." Caleb moved closer, looking at the maps over her shoulder. "What happens if you succeed? If you actually get the documents?" Then we have proof, real proof of systematic fraud, and we take it to someone who can do something about it. And if nobody cares? If the system's too broken to fix? Then at least we tried. At least we fought back. She looked up at him. Don't you want that? To fight back instead of just accepting defeat? Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or memory. My father fought back, he said quietly. Spent his whole life fighting this land, fighting debt, fighting the system. Died exhausted and broken with nothing to show for it. Sometimes I think accepting defeat earlier would have been kinder. You don't believe that. Don't I? No. Because if you did, you wouldn't have let me stay. Wouldn't have helped me organize people, wouldn't be planning this with me now. You want to fight. You're just scared it won't matter. Of course I'm scared it won't matter. Nothing's mattered out here for years. Eliza stood, faced him directly. Then let's make it matter. One way or another, let's make enough noise that people can't ignore it. Caleb held her gaze, and something passed between them in that moment. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition of two people who'd been beaten down separately deciding to stand up together. All right, he said, we make noise, but you're not going in alone. Caleb, I mean it. This plan's already suicidal. At least if we're both there, we can watch each other's backs. Someone needs to stay with the homestead. Thomas can check on it, or Mary. But I'm not letting you walk into Brennan's estate alone. They stared at each other, neither willing to back down, until finally Eliza nodded. Together, then. Together. The night before the gathering, Eliza couldn't sleep. She lay on her thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, running through the plan over and over, looking for flaws, for mistakes, for the 100 ways this could go wrong. Around midnight, she gave up and went into the main room. Caleb was there, sitting by the dying fire, clearly having the same problems with sleep. Nervous? He asked. Terrified. Good. Means you're thinking clearly. She sat across from him. You don't have to do this. I meant what I said about going alone. And I meant what I said about not letting you. We're partners in this now, all the way through. Even if it ends badly? Especially if it ends badly, nobody should die alone. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Thank you, Eliza said quietly. For everything. For not giving up. For believing this might work. For, she gestured vaguely, for seeing me as more than just the problem Brennan dumped on you. You were never a problem. Caleb's voice was rough. Maybe the opposite. You made me remember why staying alive was worth the effort. Something shifted in Eliza's chest, something warm and complicated that she didn't have words for. When this is over, she said, assuming we survive. What then? Honestly, I haven't thought that far ahead. Me neither. Just seemed like something we should talk about. We could talk about it after, if there is an after. Fair enough. They sat in silence for a while longer, the fire crackling down to embers, the night pressing close around the cabin. I should try to sleep, Eliza said eventually, though she didn't move. Probably. Big day tomorrow. Caleb? Yeah? If this goes wrong, if we don't make it out, I want you to know I don't regret any of it. Being here, fighting back, all of it, even if it ends badly. He looked at her across the dimness, his face half in shadow, and something in his expression made her breath catch. I don't regret it either, he said softly. Any of it. Then they both stood, awkward suddenly, and moved to their separate rooms without another word. But Eliza lay awake for another hour, her heart beating faster than it should, thinking about partnership and risk and the strange alchemy of two broken people finding strength in each other. Tomorrow, they'd either pull off the impossible or die trying. Tonight, she'd let herself feel something other than anger and determination. Hope, maybe. Or something close enough to count. The gathering was set for 2 in the afternoon, which meant they had to arrive early to position themselves properly. Caleb drove the wagon, Eliza beside him, both of them silent with tension. Brennan's estate sat on the best land in the county, naturally, sprawling and well-maintained in a way that made every struggling homestead look like a deliberate insult. The main house was 3 stories, painted white, surrounded by manicured gardens that required more water than most farmers used in a season. A reminder of power, of who had it and who didn't. Wagons and horses were already gathering in the wide yard when they arrived, families who looked as desperate and worn as Eliza felt. She recognized some: the Carlsons, the Hendersons, Jacob Morrison. Others were strangers, but they all had the same exhausted look of people who'd been ground down by circumstance. Brennan's targets, his victims, all gathered in one place. "Stay close," Caleb murmured as they climbed down from the wagon. "And remember the plan." The plan was simple in theory, difficult in execution. While everyone was occupied with Brennan's meeting, Eliza and Caleb would slip away, use the service entrance Mary had described, make their way to Brennan's office, find the original contracts, and get out before anyone noticed. Simple. Except for the guards, the locks, the possibility of being caught, and the near certainty of violence if they were discovered. But they were committed now. Brennan himself appeared on the front porch, and a hush fell over the gathered crowd. He was exactly as Eliza remembered: tall, well-dressed, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to worry about consequences. His smile was warm and welcoming, which somehow made him more menacing. "Friends," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Thank you all for coming. I know these are difficult times, and I appreciate your willingness to work with me towards solutions that benefit everyone." Lies. Every word was lies, and everyone there knew it, but nobody said anything. Fear kept them silent. "Please, come inside. We have refreshments prepared, and we'll discuss how we can restructure these debts to give everyone a better chance at success." More lies. The restructuring would only make things worse, Eliza knew. Tighter terms, higher interest, more control. But people filed inside anyway, because what choice did they have? Eliza and Caleb followed, but slowly, letting others go ahead. Mary had said the service entrance was on the east side, accessible through a side door that staff used for deliveries. They needed to time this perfectly. Inside, the house was everything the struggling homesteads weren't: spacious, clean, decorated with furniture that cost more than most people earned in a year. Another reminder of the gap between Brennan's world and theirs. "This way," Caleb whispered, guiding her toward a hallway that led away from the main gathering room. They moved quickly, but not so quickly that they'd draw attention. Just two people who needed to step away for a moment. Nothing unusual. The hallway opened into a servant's corridor, narrow and plain, the real bones of the house showing through. Eliza's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "There," Caleb said, pointing to a door that should lead outside. They slipped through it into the bright afternoon sun, then quickly around the side of the house toward the service entrance Mary had described. So far, so good. The service door was unlocked, staff coming and going for the gathering, and they slipped inside without incident. Now they were in the real working parts of the estate, kitchen sounds and voices echoing from somewhere nearby. "Office is upstairs," Eliza whispered, remembering Mary's maps. "Second floor, east wing." They found a back staircase and climbed quickly, every creak of the wood sounding impossibly loud. At the top, they paused, listening. Voices below, but nothing on this level. The house staff would be occupied with the gathering. They moved down the corridor, checking doors, until they found the one Mary had marked on her map. Brennan's private office. Caleb tried the handle. Locked. "Can you pick it?" Eliza asked. "Maybe." "Watch the hallway." He pulled out a knife and a piece of wire he'd fashioned into a makeshift lockpick, working at the mechanism with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he'd done this before. Eliza stood guard, her nerves screaming, every sound making her jump. Footsteps somewhere below. A door closing. Voices too distant to make out words. "Got it," Caleb said, and the lock clicked open. They slipped inside, closing the door behind them. Brennan's office was exactly what Eliza expected. Orderly, expensive, dominated by a massive desk covered in papers. Filing cabinets lined one wall, and a safe sat in the corner. "Where do we start?" Caleb asked. "The filing cabinets. Look for anything labeled with family names or debt records." They worked quickly, rifling through drawers, scanning documents. Most of it was business correspondence, land deeds, invoices. But in the third cabinet, Eliza found what they were looking for. A folder labeled Active Debt Contracts. She pulled it out, opened it, and her hand started shaking. Dozens of contracts. All the families in debt to Brennan. All the terms that had trapped them. And as she started comparing them to the copies she'd seen, the ones people had been given, The differences were immediately clear. The interest rates were higher in the originals. The penalty clauses more severe. In some cases, entire sections had been added after the signatures, terms that the borrowers had never agreed to. Fraud. Clear, documented fraud. "Eliza," Caleb said urgently, "we need to go, now." She looked up. "Why?" "Because I just heard footsteps in the hall, and they're getting closer." Her blood went cold. They'd been so focused on finding evidence they hadn't heard someone approaching. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Eliza shoved the folder under her shirt, praying it wouldn't be visible, and looked around frantically for another exit. But there was only one door, and someone was about to come through it. The handle started to turn. Caleb moved fast, grabbing Eliza's arm and pulling her behind the heavy curtains that covered the office window just as the door swung open. They pressed themselves flat against the wall, barely breathing, the folder of contracts digging into Eliza's ribs where she'd hidden it. Footsteps entered the room, not hurried. Casual, like whoever it was belonged there. Through the gap in the curtains, Eliza could see a man in servant's clothing moving toward the desk. He picked up a stack of papers, shuffled through them, then set them back down. Just retrieving something for Brennan, probably. Nothing to do with them. But he wasn't leaving. Instead, he walked toward the window, and Eliza's heart stopped completely. If he opened those curtains, they were done. Caught, exposed, probably killed. The man reached for the curtain pull. Then a voice called from the hallway. "Davies, Mr. Brennan needs those documents now, not next week." The man, Davies, sighed heavily. "Coming," he called back, and turned away from the window. The footsteps retreated. The door closed. Eliza didn't move for a full 30 seconds, didn't trust her legs to hold her if she tried. Beside her, Caleb was rigid as stone, his hand still gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. "That was too close," he whispered finally. "We need to get out of here. Now." They emerged from behind the curtains, checked the hallway, found it empty. Moved quickly back toward the servants' stairs, every second feeling like an eternity, every sound making Eliza expect someone to grab them from behind. They made it to the first floor, back into the service corridor, almost to the exit when voices erupted from the main gathering room, angry voices, getting louder. "This is robbery," someone shouted. Thomas Carlson, Eliza realized. "You're doubling the interest rates and having the payment time. Nobody can meet these terms." "Then perhaps you shouldn't have borrowed money you couldn't repay." Brennan's voice, smooth as oil and twice as slick. "You changed the contracts. These aren't the terms we agreed to." The crowd was getting agitated now, multiple voices rising in protest. Eliza could hear the fear underneath the anger, people who'd been pushed too far finally pushing back. "We should go," Caleb urged, while everyone's distracted. But Eliza hesitated, listening to the chaos building in the next room. These were her people now. The families she'd spent weeks organizing, gathering information from, building trust with. And they were standing up to Brennan, finally finding their voices. She couldn't just run. "Eliza, we have the documents. That's what we came for. We need to leave before someone realizes they're missing." He was right. She knew he was right. But something in her refused to walk away while the confrontation she'd helped spark was happening without her. "Just 1 minute," she said. And before Caleb could stop her, she moved toward the gathering room. The scene inside was chaos barely held in check. Brennan stood at the front, flanked by 2 large men who were clearly there for intimidation rather than hospitality. The crowd, maybe 40 people packed into a space meant for 20, was pressed close, their faces showing a mix of rage and desperation. "You've been stealing from us for years," Mary Chen's voice cut through the noise. "My husband died because he figured out what you were doing." "Your husband died in an unfortunate accident," Brennan said, his voice cold now, the friendly mask slipping. "I suggest you don't make wild accusations you can't prove." "We can prove it," Eliza heard herself say, stepping into the room. Every head turned toward her. Brennan's eyes narrowed, recognition flickering across his face. "Miss Thorne, or should I say Mrs. Rourke?" His smile was predatory. "I wondered when you'd make an appearance. I trust your new accommodations are to your satisfaction." "They're exactly what you intended them to be, punishment for not knowing my place. And yet here you are, out of your place once again." He gestured to his men. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No need." Eliza pulled the folder from under her shirt, held it up for everyone to see. I think we should discuss it right here, in front of everyone whose lives you've destroyed. The room went silent. Brennan's expression shifted from amusement to something harder, more dangerous. That's my private property. I suggest you return it immediately. These are the original contracts, Eliza said, addressing the crowd now. The real terms, before Brennan altered them. And they're different from what you were given. Different interest rates, different penalties, different terms entirely. She opened the folder, started reading. Thomas Carlson, you were told 10% interest. The original contract says 15. The Hendersons, you thought you had 3 years to repay. The original says 18 months. Gasps rippled through the room as she continued, family after family, revealing the fraud that had trapped them all. That's enough, Brennan said, his voice like ice. He nodded to his men. Retrieve those documents, by force, if necessary. The two men started forward, but the crowd shifted, bodies moving to block them. Not organized, not planned, just a spontaneous human wall between Brennan's enforcers and the woman holding proof of his crimes. You touch her, you go through all of us, Thomas Carlson said, and others echoed the sentiment. For the first time since Eliza had known of him, Marcus Brennan looked uncertain, outnumbered, his control slipping, faced with people who'd finally found something worth fighting for. This is my house, he said, voice rising. You're all trespassing. I could have you arrested. By your sheriff? Old Jacob Morrison called out. The one you bought? Good luck with that when federal authorities see these documents. You think federal authorities care about frontier debt disputes? I think they care about systematic fraud, Eliza said. About forged contracts and altered agreements, and a pattern of exploitation spanning years. And I think when presented with this much evidence, even your connections won't be enough to make it disappear. Brennan's face went dark with rage. You have no idea what you're doing, no idea the forces you're playing with. I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm exposing you for what you are, a thief hiding behind legal paperwork. I built this region, Brennan snarled, brought civilization to wilderness, created opportunity where there was nothing. These people would have nothing without me. These people have nothing because of you, Eliza shot back. You didn't build opportunity. You built a trap and baited it with desperation. The crowd was with her now. She could feel it. The fear that had kept them silent for so long was burning away, replaced by anger that had been suppressed too long. What do we do? Someone called out. How do we fight this? We take these documents to the territorial capital, Eliza said. We file formal complaints with federal authorities. We make enough noise that someone has to listen. And who's going to make this trip? Brennan asked, his voice dripping with contempt. Which of you has the time or money to ride 4 days to the capital? Who can afford to leave their failing homesteads long enough to file paperwork that will probably be ignored anyway? The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of that truth. They were all trapped by circumstances, by poverty, by the endless grind of survival that left no room for legal battles. I'll go, Eliza said. You? Brennan laughed. Your property, Miss Thorne, transferred ownership to settle your father's debts. You have no legal standing to do anything. That transfer was based on fraudulent debt, which means it's invalid. Prove it in court. Oh, wait. You can't afford a lawyer, can you? Eliza felt Caleb move up beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. She's not alone, Caleb said. We'll all contribute what we can. Pool resources, hire representation, do this right. With what money? Brennan's confidence was returning now, sensing weakness. You're all broke. That's the point. You have nothing. You are nothing. And you will die with nothing because that's what people like you deserve. The words hit like physical blows, and Eliza could see people flinching, the brief moment of courage wavering. We have these documents, she said, holding up the folder, and we have each other. That's more than nothing. Documents can be lost, Brennan said softly, dangerously. Accidents happen. Houses burn, people disappear. The frontier's a dangerous place. The threat was clear, and the room went cold with it. You threatening us? Thomas demanded. I'm stating facts. Unfortunate things happen to people who make poor choices. Like my husband? Mary Chen's voice shook with rage. Was his death an unfortunate thing? Brennan's smile was cruel. I'm sure I don't know what you're implying. The tension in the room was building towards something explosive, violence barely held in check by the thinnest margin. Then a new voice cut through the chaos. Actually, I think you know exactly what she's implying. Everyone turned. A man stood in the doorway, tall and official-looking, with the bearing of someone used to authority. Behind him were two others similarly dressed, and they all wore badges that caught the afternoon light. Federal marshals. Brennan's face went pale. What's the meaning of this? Marshal Andrew Clayton, the man said, stepping into the room. We've been investigating reports of fraudulent lending practices in this region for the past 3 months. And unless I'm mistaken, that young woman is holding evidence we'd be very interested in examining. Eliza stared at him, her mind racing. 3 months? Someone filed an anonymous complaint with the territorial governor's office. Detailed allegations of systematic fraud, forged documents, exploitation of farmers. We've been working our way through the county, gathering testimony. He looked directly at Brennan, and now it seems we have documentary evidence to support those allegations. Those documents are private property, Brennan said, but his voice had lost its confidence. Those documents are evidence in a federal investigation. Miss, I'll need you to turn those over. Liza hesitated, every instinct screaming not to trust anyone in authority. But Caleb squeezed her shoulder, and she saw hope in the faces around her. She handed over the folder. Marshal Clayton flipped through it, his expression darkening with each page. Mr. Brennan, I'm going to need you to come with us. We have questions about these contracts and about several other matters that have come to light during our investigation. This is absurd. I'm a respected businessman, a pillar of this community. You're a suspect in a fraud investigation. And if these documents are authentic, you're looking at federal charges. Clayton nodded to his men. Take him. What followed was chaos of a different kind. Brennan protesting loudly, his enforcers not sure whether to resist federal marshals, the crowd pressing closer to watch the man who'd controlled their lives for so long being led away in shackles. Eliza stood frozen, hardly able to process what had just happened. They'd come here expecting to steal evidence and run. Instead, they'd walked into a federal investigation that was already underway. Who filed the complaint? She asked Clayton. The anonymous one? The marshal smiled slightly. Can't say. Anonymous means anonymous. But whoever it was, they did their homework. Gave us enough to start digging, and once we started, we found a lot more than we expected. Mom, he turned to address the crowd. We'll need statements from all of you. Names, details of your contracts, any threats or intimidation you experienced. This is going to take time, but I promise you, we take fraud seriously. And if Mr. Brennan is guilty of what these documents suggest, he'll face consequences. People started talking at once, relief and anger and hope all mixing together. Eliza felt Caleb's arm around her shoulders, steadying her as the room spun slightly. We did it, he said, sounding as stunned as she felt. We actually did it. We got lucky if those marshals hadn't shown up. But they did. And Brennan's in custody, and people are finally going to be heard. Eliza wanted to feel triumphant, but exhaustion was catching up with her, the adrenaline crash making her hands shake. It's not over. He's got connections, money, lawyers. This could still go wrong in 100 different ways. But it could also go right. For the first time in years, it could actually go right. She leaned against him, letting herself have one moment of relief before the next crisis hit. Because there would be a next crisis. There always was. But for now, Marcus Brennan was in chains, and the people he'd exploited for so long were speaking truth to power, and that was something. The marshals spent the rest of the afternoon taking statements, documenting claims, building their case. Eliza and Caleb gave detailed accounts of what they'd found, how they'd discovered the discrepancies, what they'd risked to get the evidence. You broke into his office, Clayton said, not quite a question. We retrieved stolen property, Eliza corrected. Those contracts belong to the people who signed them, not to the man who altered them. Clayton's expression suggested he knew exactly what she'd done and was choosing to interpret it generously. Well, regardless of how we obtained the evidence, it's damning. Combined with the testimony we're gathering, this should be enough to bring formal charges. What happens now? Caleb asked. Now we take Brennan to the territorial capital for arraignment. The investigation continues. We'll need more statements, more evidence, but the foundation is solid. He paused. This won't be fast. Legal proceedings rarely are, but it will be thorough. And in the meantime, Thomas Carlson spoke up, what happens to our debts, our land? That's complicated. Until the court rules on the validity of the contracts, they're technically still in effect. But I can't imagine any judge allowing foreclosures to proceed while the underlying documents are under investigation. Can't imagine isn't the same as guaranteed, Thomas said bitterly. No, it's not. But it's better odds than you had this morning. The gathering broke up slowly, people drifting back to their wagons in small groups, talking in low voices. The emotional whiplash of the day had left everyone exhausted, and Eliza could see it in their faces, hope and fear fighting for dominance. Mary Chen approached as Eliza and Caleb were preparing to leave. Thank you, she said simply. For my husband. For all of us. I didn't do it alone. But you started it. You refused to accept things as they were. That matters. She squeezed Eliza's hand. Be careful. Men like Brennan don't go down easy, and they don't forgive. I know. The ride home was quiet, both of them too wrung out for conversation. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire, and Eliza watched it from the wagon seat with a strange sense of detachment. They'd done something impossible today, survived something that should have killed them, changed something that everyone said couldn't be changed, and she had no idea what came next. Back at the homestead, they went through evening chores on autopilot, tending animals and securing buildings with the kind of muscle memory that didn't require thought. Only when they were inside, door barred, fire built, did they finally let themselves stop. Caleb poured whiskey without asking if she wanted it, and Eliza accepted the cup gratefully. To surviving, he said. To more than surviving, Eliza countered. To actually fighting back. They drank. The whiskey burning but welcome. What you did today, Caleb said after a long silence. Stepping into that room, confronting Brennan in front of everyone, that was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most reckless. Probably both. Definitely both. He set down his cup. You could have been killed, should have been killed probably, if those marshals hadn't shown up, but they did. By sheer luck. By someone filing a complaint 3 months ago, Eliza corrected. Someone else was already fighting this before we started. We just added fuel to a fire that was already burning. Any idea who? No, but I'd like to thank them. They sat in silence for a while, processing, the weight of the day slowly settling into something manageable. The debt, Eliza said eventually. Clayton said the contracts are under investigation, but that doesn't mean they're void. We might still owe money. So if the contracts are fraudulent, the debts might be too. Might, a lot of mights and maybes. Better than the certainty of losing everything, Caleb pointed out. He was right. Whatever happened next, they'd bought themselves time, room to breathe, to plan, to figure out the next move. What do you think happens to Brennan? Eliza asked. If there's any justice. Prison. Years of it. Caleb's expression hardened. But men like him don't usually face real consequences. They have lawyers, connections, ways to make problems disappear. Not this time. Not with federal marshals involved and evidence this clear. You have more faith in the system than I do. I have faith that we made it harder for him to escape. That has to count for something. Caleb studied her in the firelight. You really believe that, don't you? That fighting back matters even if we don't win? I have to believe it. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? He nodded slowly, understanding in the gesture. You've changed me, you know? Made me remember how to hope for things. Hope's dangerous. So is giving up. They held each other's gaze across the small space, and Eliza felt that same complicated warmth from the night before. Partnership, yes. But something more, something she wasn't ready to name. We should sleep, she said, breaking the moment. Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps. Tomorrow, Caleb agreed. But neither of them moved, both reluctant to end the day, to let go of the strange victory they'd won. Finally, Eliza stood, swaying slightly with exhaustion. Thank you for coming with me today, for having my back. Always, Caleb said, and the word felt like a promise. Eliza went to her room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed. Her whole body ached, muscles she'd forgotten she had protesting every movement. The folder's edge had left a bruise on her ribs, and her hands were shaking with delayed adrenaline. But she'd done it. They'd done it. Exposed Marcus Brennan, given voice to people who'd been silent too long, maybe, just maybe, started something that could actually change things. She fell asleep still in her clothes, too exhausted even to properly undress. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't dream of traps and debt and slow suffocation. She dreamed of open horizons and possibilities that hadn't existed before. The next few weeks were strange, suspended between crisis and resolution. The Marshals' investigation continued, bringing more federal officials to the region, conducting interviews, seizing Brennan's records. Word spread, and families from neighboring counties came forward with their own stories of exploitation. The scope of Brennan's operation was larger than anyone had realized. Dozens of families, hundreds of acres, years of systematic fraud. And at the center of it all, the contracts Eliza had stolen, providing the documentary foundation for everything else. "You're going to have to testify," Marshal Clayton told her during one of his visits. "When this goes to trial, you'll be a key witness." "I'll be there," Eliza said. "It won't be pleasant. Brennan's lawyers will try to discredit you, attack your character, make you look like an unreliable witness." "Oh, let them try." Clayton smiled slightly. "You're tougher than you look." "I've had to be." Meanwhile, life on the homestead continued. Crops needed tending, animals needed feeding, repairs needed making. The work didn't stop just because the legal system was finally paying attention. But something had shifted in the community. People who'd been isolated, competitive, desperate, started helping each other. Thomas Carlson brought over seed he could spare. Mary Chen organized a work exchange, families trading labor when someone fell behind. Old Jacob Morrison, energized by the investigation, started holding informal gatherings where people could share information and support. Slowly, painfully, a community was forming from the fragments Brennan had kept deliberately separate. "This is what he was afraid of," Eliza said to Caleb one evening, watching neighbors help repair a fence section. People working together, realizing they're stronger as a group. "Divide and conquer only works if people stay divided," Caleb agreed. "So we stay united. Whatever happens with the trial, we keep this going." Easier said than done. People get tired, scared, fall back into old patterns. Then we remind them why we're fighting, keep the anger alive long enough to see this through. Caleb looked at her with something that might have been admiration or might have been concern. "You never stop, do you?" "Can't afford to." "The second we stop pushing, everything slides backward." He shook his head but smiled. "You're going to change this whole region, aren't you?" "I'm going to try." 6 weeks after the confrontation at Brennan's estate, word came that the trial date had been set. 3 months out in the territorial capital, with a federal judge presiding. "They're taking it seriously," Clayton confirmed. "This isn't going to be some local affair that gets swept aside. Real charges, real consequences if he's convicted." "And if he's not," Eliza asked, "then we regroup and try again. But between the documentary evidence and the testimony we've gathered, I like our chances." Our chances? Like they were all in this together. And maybe they were. The foreclosure deadline came and went without incident, the legal limbo of the investigation preventing Brennan's estate from taking any action. It was a temporary reprieve, nothing guaranteed, but it meant another season to plant, another chance to build something sustainable. Eliza threw herself into that work with renewed purpose. If they were going to keep this land, they needed to make it profitable, which meant thinking bigger than just survival. She spent evenings poring over agricultural texts, calculating yields, planning crop rotations. During the day, she worked alongside Caleb to implement those plans, turning theory into practice. "You know this might all be for nothing," Caleb said one afternoon, watching her stake out sections for different plantings. "If the trial goes wrong, we lose everything anyway. Then we'll have lost while trying to build something instead of just waiting to die. I prefer it that way." "You prefer everything the hard way. Only way I know." But there was affection in his voice now, the kind that came from months of working alongside someone, seeing them at their worst and their best and everything in between. They'd become partners. Real partners, not just people trapped by circumstance. And something about that mattered more than Eliza wanted to admit. One evening, with the trial now 2 months away, Caleb brought up something they'd been dancing around for weeks. What happens after? He asked. Assuming we win, assuming the debts are voided, assuming we actually get to keep this land, what then? Then we build something real. Make this place work the way it should. And us? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. What about us? Eliza asked, though she knew exactly what he was asking. This marriage. It was forced, fake, a transaction neither of us wanted. He paused. But it doesn't feel fake anymore. Hasn't for a while. Eliza's heart was beating faster than it should. No, it doesn't. So what do we do about that? She didn't have an answer. Hadn't let herself think that far ahead because thinking ahead felt like tempting fate. I don't know, she admitted. I've been so focused on fighting, on surviving, I haven't thought about what comes after the fight. Maybe it's time to start thinking about it. Maybe. She looked at him directly. What do you want? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with honesty. I want to stop pretending this is temporary. I want to build something with you, not just survive alongside you. I want... He stopped, struggling for words. I want this to be real. Something cracked open in Eliza's chest, something she'd kept locked away for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. It already is real, she said quietly. Has been for a while. I just didn't know how to say it. Caleb's smile was different than his usual careful expressions. Genuine, warm, unguarded. So we make it official? For real this time? We're already married. You know what I mean. Choice instead of circumstance. Eliza nodded, feeling tears prick her eyes for the first time since arriving at this harsh frontier. Yes, choice instead of circumstance. Partners for real. He crossed the space between them and pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home after a long journey. And Eliza, who'd learned to keep herself hard and distant and untouchable, let herself soften into it. They'd been through hell together, fought impossible battles, survived things that should have destroyed them, built something from nothing, and now maybe they could build something more. The journey to the territorial capital took 5 days, longer than expected because spring rains had turned the roads into rivers of mud. Eliza and Caleb traveled with Marshal Clayton and a small convoy of witnesses, Thomas and Mary Carlson, Jacob Morrison, the widow Chen, and a half-dozen others whose testimony would help build the case against Marcus Brennan. It was strange, this caravan of broken families heading towards something that might be justice. They camped together at night, shared food, told stories around fires that fought against the rain, and slowly, Eliza saw what they were becoming, not just victims seeking restitution, but a community forged in shared struggle. You think they'll believe us? Mary asked one evening, sitting close to the fire for warmth. Federal judges, lawyers, people who've never lived like we do? They'll believe the documents, Eliza said. Numbers don't lie the way people can. But Brennan's got money for good lawyers. They'll twist everything, make it seem like we're the problem. Let them try. We've got truth on our side. Mary smiled, but it was tired. You still believe truth matters in a courtroom? I have to believe it. Otherwise, we've already lost. The Capitol was larger than Eliza had imagined, sprawling and chaotic in a way that made Ridgeline look like a child's drawing of a town. Buildings rose 3 and 4 stories, streets crowded with wagons and people, noise and commerce, and the kind of energy that came from too many humans packed too close together. It was overwhelming and magnificent and slightly terrifying all at once. Marshal Clayton arranged lodging for the witnesses at a modest hotel, the kind of place that had seen better days but was clean enough and cheap enough for federal budgets. Eliza found herself sharing a room with Mary and the widow Chen, the 3 of them crowded into a space barely bigger than her room back at the homestead. You nervous? The widow Chen asked that first night, watching Eliza pace the small room. Terrified. Good. Means you're taking it seriously. The trial was set to begin in 2 days, giving everyone time to prepare, to meet with the prosecutors, to go over testimony until the words felt rehearsed and hollow. Just tell the truth, the lead prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Morrison, no relation to Jacob, told them. Don't embellish, don't guess, just state facts as you experience them. What if Brennan's lawyers make us look stupid? Thomas asked. They'll try. That's their job. But the judge isn't stupid, and neither is the jury. They'll see through the theater if you stay honest. Easy to say. Harder to do when your entire future hung on convincing 12 strangers that you deserve justice. The night before the trial, Eliza couldn't sleep. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to Mary and the widow breathing in the darkness, and tried to quiet her mind enough to rest. Around midnight, she gave up and slipped out of the room, moving quietly through the hotel's dim hallways until she found herself outside. The street was nearly empty, just a few late wanderers and the distant sound of a saloon still doing business. She walked without direction, just needing to move, to burn off the anxious energy that made her skin feel too tight. Couldn't sleep either? She turned to find Caleb leaning against a lamppost, his face half in shadow. How'd you know I'd be out here? Because I know you. You don't sit still when you're worried. She moved to stand beside him, their shoulders almost touching. What if this doesn't work? What if the judge sides with Brennan, or the jury doesn't care, or the law protects men like him instead of people like us? Then we tried, and we made him fight for it instead of just handing everything over. That's not enough. Maybe not, but it's what we've got. They stood in silence for a while, watching the empty street, the distant mountains barely visible against the night sky. I keep thinking about my mother, Eliza said quietly. She used to say that power respects power, nothing else. That being right didn't matter if you didn't have the strength to enforce it. You think she was right? I think she died poor and powerless despite being right about everything. So maybe. Caleb turned to face her. But you're still fighting anyway. Because what else is there? Give up and prove her right? Accept that power is all that matters? She shook her head. I'd rather die trying to prove her wrong. You're not going to die. We're going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow, tell the truth, and let the system do what it's supposed to do. You have more faith in the system than I do. I have faith in you. That's different. The words hit her harder than they should have, warming something deep in her chest. We should get some sleep, she said, not moving. Probably. But they stood there for another hour, talking quietly about nothing important. Just two people trying to convince themselves that tomorrow might bring something other than disaster. The courtroom was smaller than Eliza expected, but more intimidating. Dark wood paneling, high ceilings, rows of benches for spectators already filling with curious locals who'd heard about the fraud case. The judge's bench loomed at the front, empty but threatening in its implications. And at the defense table, Marcus Brennan sat flanked by 3 lawyers in expensive suits, looking calm and confident and utterly unconcerned. He caught Eliza's eye as she entered and smiled. Not friendly, predatory. A reminder that he still considered himself in control, that this was just an inconvenience he'd overcome through money and connections. She stared back until he looked away first. Small victory, but she'd take it. The trial started with opening statements, the prosecutor laying out the case in dry legal language that somehow made Brennan's crimes sound almost boring. Systematic fraud, breach of contract, falsification of documents, conspiracy to defraud. Words that didn't capture the reality of families destroyed, lives ruined, people crushed under the weight of impossible debt. Then Brennan's lead lawyer stood, and his opening was pure theater. Talked about how Brennan had brought civilization to the wilderness, created opportunity where there was none, helped struggling farmers through difficult times, painted his client as a benefactor being attacked by ungrateful recipients of his generosity. It was masterful and infuriating and exactly what Eliza had expected. They're going to make us look like we're the problem, Mary whispered. Let them, Eliza whispered back. We've got documents. They've got stories. The prosecution called witnesses one by one. Thomas Carlson described how his debt had grown despite payments. Jacob Morrison detailed years of harassment and threats. The widow Chen testified about her husband's suspicious death, her voice breaking but staying strong. And through it all, Brennan's lawyers attacked. Questioned every detail, suggested ulterior motives, implied the witnesses were unreliable or vengeful or simply mistaken. It was brutal to watch, seeing good people torn apart on the stand. Their pain treated as performance, their suffering dismissed as confusion. Then they called Eliza. She walked to the witness stand feeling like she was moving through water, everything slow and surreal. The bailiff swore her in, and she sat facing the courtroom, aware of every eye on her. The prosecutor started gentle, establishing who she was, how she'd come to be involved, what she'd discovered. Easy questions designed to put her at ease. Then he asked about the contracts. I found the original documents in Mr. Brennan's private office, Eliza said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. They showed different terms than what the borrowers had been given. Higher interest rates, shorter payment periods, penalties that weren't disclosed. And how did you gain access to Mr. Brennan's private office? This was the tricky part, the moment where she either admitted to breaking in or lied under oath. I entered the estate during a gathering Mr. Brennan was hosting. The office door was unlocked. I went in looking for evidence of fraud, and I found it. Technically true. Just missing the part about picking the lock. The prosecutor nodded, accepting the explanation, and continued building the case. By the time he finished, Eliza felt wrung out, but intact. Then Brennan's lawyer stood for cross-examination, and everything got worse. "Mrs. Rourke," he began, his tone suggesting the title was questionable. "Or should I say Miss Thorne? Since your marriage was arranged to settle a debt, is it even legally valid?" "Objection," the prosecutor said. "Relevance. Goes to credibility, Your Honor. If the witness is willing to enter a fraudulent marriage, why should we believe her testimony about fraudulent contracts?" The judge considered. "I'll allow it, but tread carefully, counselor." The lawyer smiled. "Miss Thorne, you were transferred to Mr. Rourke as payment for your father's debts, correct?" "I was sold like property, yes." "And you harbor resentment toward Mr. Brennan for this arrangement?" "I harbor resentment toward being treated as property by anyone." "So you admit to bias against my client?" "I admit to recognizing systematic exploitation when I see it." Systematic exploitation or personal grievance? The lawyer circled closer. "Isn't it true that you entered Mr. Brennan's employ willingly, signed a contract agreeing to work off your father's debt?" "I signed under duress. My father was dying, and we had no other options." "But you did sign, just as these other witnesses signed their loan agreements. And now that the terms are inconvenient, you cry fraud." "The terms were fraudulent from the beginning. The documents prove it." "Documents you obtained by breaking into private property." "Documents that expose criminal behavior." The exchange continued, the lawyer trying to paint her as vindictive and unreliable, Eliza refusing to back down. By the time he finished, she was exhausted and angry, but she'd held her ground. The trial continued for 3 more days. Expert witnesses testified about the documents, explaining how the alterations had been made, when, by whom. Financial analysts showed the mathematical impossibility of repaying debts structured the way Brennan's were. And through it all, the prosecution built a case that felt overwhelming in its clarity. But Brennan's defense was equally skilled. They produced character witnesses who spoke of his generosity, business partners who testified to his integrity, documents that seemed to support his version of events. And they hammered away at the credibility of the witnesses, suggesting conspiracy, coordination, fabrication. It was impossible to tell which side was winning. On the final day, both sides gave closing arguments. The prosecutor spoke passionately about justice for the powerless, about holding the powerful accountable, about the documents that proved beyond doubt that Marcus Brennan had systematically defrauded dozens of families. Then Brennan's lawyer stood and delivered a masterpiece of misdirection. Talked about the risks of business, the difficulty of frontier lending, the unfortunate reality that not all ventures succeeded, suggested that the witnesses were bitter about their own failures and looking for someone to blame. And then he said something that made Eliza's blood run cold. "My client is a successful businessman who took risks to help struggling families. If we punish success, if we criminalize the very lending that makes frontier development possible, we destroy the system that built this territory. The question before you isn't whether Mr. Brennan profited. Of course he did. That's how business works. The question is whether his profit came from fraud or from legitimate enterprise. And the evidence, when examined honestly, supports the latter. It was brilliant and infuriating and possibly persuasive enough to work. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 days of waiting, of pacing hotel rooms, of trying not to think about what failure would mean. Eliza barely ate, couldn't sleep, drove everyone around her slightly crazy with her anxious energy. "They're taking too long," she told Caleb. "That's bad, right? If it was clear-cut, they'd have decided already. Or they're being thorough, making sure they get it right. You're just saying that to make me feel better." "Is it working?" "No. He pulled her close, and she let herself lean into him, drawing strength from his steadiness. Whatever happened, at least they'd faced it together. The call came on the afternoon of the second day. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, spectators crowding in to hear the outcome of a trial that had captured the territory's attention. Eliza sat in the front row, Caleb beside her, hands clasped so tight her fingers went numb. The jury filed in, their faces giving nothing away. The judge took his seat. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of systematic fraud, how do you find?" The foreman stood, unfolding a piece of paper with agonizing slowness. "We find the defendant, Marcus Brennan, guilty." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, someone crying. Eliza sat frozen, hardly able to process what she'd heard. Guilty. They'd won. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. On the additional charges of falsification of documents, conspiracy to defraud, and breach of contract? "Guilty on all counts, Your Honor." More chaos. Brennan's face had gone ashen, his lawyers already moving to surround him, talking urgently. But the verdict stood. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks out and adjourned the court. And as people pressed forward, congratulating the witnesses, celebrating the victory, Eliza found she couldn't move. They'd actually won. After everything, after all the fear and struggle and impossible odds, they'd won. Caleb pulled her up, wrapped her in an embrace that felt like safety and triumph all mixed together. Around them, families were hugging, crying, laughing with relief and disbelief. Marshal Clayton approached, wearing a satisfied smile. "Congratulations. You did it." "We all did it," Eliza managed. "But you started it. Filed that anonymous complaint 6 months ago that got the investigation rolling." Eliza stared at him. "What?" "The anonymous complaint. The one that detailed Brennan's operations gave us enough to start investigating." He paused. "That was you, wasn't it?" "I never filed any complaint. I didn't even know how until a few weeks ago." Clayton frowned. "Then who—" "I did," a voice said from behind them. They turned to find Jacob Morrison standing there, looking older but somehow lighter than he had in months. "You?" Eliza said. "6 months ago, I wrote to the territorial governor, detailed everything I knew about Brennan's operations, names of families he'd destroyed, patterns I'd observed over years of fighting him. Didn't sign it because I was scared, but I sent it anyway." He smiled, tired but genuine. "Figured if I was going to die anyway, might as well try to take him with me." "You started all this," Eliza said, awed. "I planted a seed. You made it grow. Made people brave enough to speak up, organized them, found the evidence that made it real." He gripped her shoulder. "We all fought this battle. That's what matters." And standing there in the crowded courtroom, surrounded by people who'd been powerless finding their voices, Eliza understood something fundamental. Change didn't come from heroes. It came from regular people deciding they'd had enough, finding each other, refusing to stay broken. It came from anonymous letters and stolen documents and testimony given despite fear. It came from community forged in shared struggle. It came from people like them. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later was anticlimactic. The judge gave Brennan 15 years in federal prison, ordered restitution for all proven victims, and dissolved the fraudulent debt contracts entirely. 15 years. Not enough for the lives he'd destroyed, but more than nothing, more than men like him usually faced. And the debts were gone, erased. The homesteads returned to their rightful owners, free and clear. The families who'd traveled to the capital for the trial stayed for the sentencing, wanting to see it through to the end. And that night, they gathered in the hotel's common room and celebrated properly for the first time. Someone produced bottles of decent whiskey. Someone else had a fiddle. And slowly, tentatively, people who'd been crushed by circumstances started to remember how to be joyful. Eliza watched from the edge of the room, still processing, still hardly believing it was real. Caleb found her there, handed her a cup of whiskey that probably cost more than they could afford. "You should be celebrating," he said. "I am, just quietly." "That's not your style." She laughed despite herself. "Maybe I'm tired of being loud. Maybe I just want to enjoy this for a minute before the next crisis hits." "What next crisis?" "We won. The debts are void. Brennan's in prison. We've got our land free and clear. What else is there?" "Making it work, building something sustainable, figuring out how to actually live instead of just survive. That sounds like a good problem to have. She turned to face him. Are you ready for that? For building instead of fighting? With you, I'm ready for anything. They stood close, the celebration noise fading to background, and Eliza felt something settle in her chest. Peace, maybe. Or the possibility of it. I love you, she said, the words surprising her as much as they seemed to surprise him. I don't think I've said it out loud yet, but I do. You're the best thing that came from the worst situation, and I don't know what I would have done without you. Caleb's smile was everything she'd been too scared to hope for. I love you too. Have for a while now, just didn't know how to say it. We're terrible at this. Probably, but we're together, so who cares? He kissed her then in front of everyone, and she kissed him back, not caring who saw or what they thought. They'd earned this, earned each other, earned their freedom, earned the right to build something new from the ashes of what Brennan had tried to destroy. The journey back to the homestead felt different than the journey out. Lighter, despite the mud and the rain and the long miles. They traveled as a group again, but this time there was laughter instead of fear, plans instead of dread. We should organize properly, Thomas Carlson said one evening around the campfire. Form some kind of cooperative, help each other with harvests and supplies, make sure we can't be isolated and exploited again. I can draft bylaws, Jacob Morrison offered. Nothing fancy, but something that protects everyone's interests. We'll need a way to pool resources for big purchases, Mary Chen added. Equipment, seeds, things that are too expensive individually. And so it began, right there in the mud and rain, the building of something that might actually work. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but possible in a way it hadn't been before. Eliza listened and contributed and felt something like hope taking root. This was what Brennan had feared most. People organizing, supporting each other, refusing to be divided. And now it was happening because they'd refused to give up. When they finally reached Ridgeline, word of the verdict had already spread. People came out to congratulate them, to ask questions, to express disbelief that someone like Brennan could actually face consequences. What happens to his property? Frank at the general store asked. The buildings he owned, the businesses. Courts handling that, Marshall Clayton said. Likely be sold off to pay restitution. You interested in buying? Frank looked thoughtful. Might be, if the price is right. Things were changing. The power structure that had seemed immutable was fracturing, and people were stepping into the gaps. The homestead looked the same when they arrived, still weathered, still in need of constant repair, still more potential than reality. But Eliza saw it differently now. This was theirs. Really theirs. Not borrowed or conditionally granted, but owned free and clear. And what they built here would be because they chose it, not because circumstance forced it. Home, Caleb said, climbing down from the wagon. Yeah, Eliza agreed. It really is. They spent the next week settling back into routines, but everything felt different. The animals seemed healthier, the land more cooperative, the work less crushing. Or maybe they were just approaching it with hope instead of desperation. News continued to filter in from the capital. Brennan's assets were being liquidated, the money distributed among his victims. It wasn't enough to make anyone rich, but it was something. A chance to reinvest, to build, to try again with better odds. And the cooperative Thomas had proposed was taking shape. Families meeting regularly, sharing resources and knowledge, creating the kind of support network that made survival more likely for everyone. This is what matters, Eliza told Caleb one evening, watching neighbors help each other with spring planting. Not the trial, not even the verdict. This, people refusing to be isolated, choosing to build together. The verdict made this possible. But this is what makes it matter. 3 months after the trial, Eliza discovered she was pregnant. She told Caleb on a quiet evening, just the two of them, and watched his face cycle through shock and joy and terror in rapid succession. We're going to be parents, he said, the words sounding strange in his mouth. Apparently. Are you scared? Terrified. But also, she searched for the right word. Ready, maybe? We've built something worth bringing a child into. Have we? We've got land, community, freedom. That's more than either of us had when we started. He pulled her close, careful suddenly, like she might break. We're going to be terrible at this. Probably. But we'll figure it out. Together. always together. The pregnancy was hard, Eliza's body protesting the additional burden on top of the physical demands of farm work. But she refused to slow down much, determined to prove that carrying a child didn't make her weak or useless. The community rallied around them without being asked. Mary Chen brought over baby clothes her children had outgrown. Thomas Carlson helped with the heavier work when Caleb couldn't manage it alone. Even Frank at the general store extended credit without question, investment in a future customer. It was the kind of support Brennan's system had made impossible. And now that he was gone, people remembered how to take care of each other. The baby, a girl they named Rose, after Eliza's mother, was born in early spring, surrounded by women who'd become family through shared struggle. She was small and loud and perfect, and holding her, Eliza felt something shift fundamentally in her understanding of what mattered. "This is what we fought for," she told Caleb, watching him hold their daughter with terrified gentleness. "Not just us, her, and everyone like her. A chance to grow up without being crushed by systems designed to destroy them. That's a lot of pressure to put on one very small human. She'll handle it. Look whose daughter she is." And watching Rose sleep, tiny fists curled tight like she was ready to fight the world already, Eliza believed it. Years passed. The homestead grew from barely functional to actually productive. The cooperative expanded to include families from 3 counties, and slowly, painfully, the region rebuilt itself into something better than what Brennan had created. It wasn't perfect. There were still bad seasons, crop failures, setbacks that felt crushing, but there was also support, community, the knowledge that failure didn't mean destruction because people would help each other through. Eliza became a voice in regional politics, advocating for protections against the kind of exploitation Brennan had perfected. She testified before territorial legislatures, helped draft regulations, used her story to illustrate why oversight mattered. Caleb focused on making the homestead sustainable, experimenting with crops and techniques, sharing what worked with other farmers. Together they built something that provided not just survival, but a decent life. And Rose grew up surrounded by people who'd fought for her right to exist freely, who'd refused to accept that power always won, who'd proven that regular people could change systems if they were brave enough to try. On the 10th anniversary of Brennan's conviction, the community held a gathering at what had been his estate. It had been sold years ago, subdivided into smaller holdings, transformed from a monument to exploitation into productive farmland. Standing there, surrounded by people who'd been victims, becoming neighbors, becoming friends, Eliza thought about everything they'd survived to get here. "You ever regret it?" Caleb asked, reading her mood. "The fighting, the risk, all of it?" "Not for a second. Even knowing how close we came to losing everything? Especially knowing that. We could have just accepted defeat, let Brennan crush us. Instead, we fought back, and look what we built." Around them, children played, including Rose, now 10 and already showing signs of her mother's stubbornness. The future they represented was uncertain, as futures always were, but it was possible in a way it hadn't been before. "You know what I think?" Eliza said. "I think my mother was wrong. Power doesn't only respect power. Sometimes power respects courage enough to challenge it. And sometimes regular people, when they refuse to stay broken, can break the systems designed to destroy them." "That's a nice thought." "It's more than a thought. It's what happened. We happened." Caleb pulled her close, and they stood watching the celebration, the community, the life they'd built from nothing but refusal to quit. The frontier was harsh. It broke people regularly, crushed dreams, turned hope into ash. But it also gave space for something else. For regular people to prove they were stronger than the circumstances trying to destroy them, for courage to matter more than power, for community to overcome isolation. Marcus Brennan had tried to build an empire on the broken backs of desperate people. And he'd succeeded for a while because that's how systems worked. The powerful crushed the powerless, and everyone pretended that was just the natural order. But Eliza Thorne, who'd been sold like property, married to a stranger, sent to die slowly on failing land, had refused to accept that natural order. She'd fought back, not because she thought she'd win, but because losing quietly felt like dying twice. And in fighting, she'd found others who were tired of quiet defeat. Together, they'd done what everyone said was impossible. They'd challenged power with nothing but truth and courage and stubborn refusal to stay broken. And they'd won. Not perfectly, not completely. There would always be another Brennan, Another system designed to exploit, another battle to fight, but they'd proven it could be done. That regular people, when they found each other and refused to stay divided, could change things that seemed unchangeable. And that mattered. That night, after the celebration ended and they'd returned home, Eliza sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Rose was asleep inside, Caleb puttering around doing evening chores, the familiar sounds of their life providing a steady rhythm. She thought about the girl she'd been when she arrived here, angry, desperate, resigned to being crushed by circumstances beyond her control. And she thought about who she'd become, a woman who'd fought impossible battles and won some of them, who'd built a life worth living instead of just enduring, who'd proven that powerlessness was often a choice disguised as inevitability. The transformation hadn't been smooth or easy. There'd been moments of doubt, nights of terror, times when giving up seemed like the only sane option. But she hadn't given up. None of them had, and that made all the difference. Caleb joined her on the porch, settling into the chair beside hers with the comfortable ease of someone who belonged there. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything?" "Nothing. How strange it is that something that started as punishment became the best thing that ever happened to me." "You turned it into the best thing. Could have gone the other way." "It almost did. Many times. But it didn't. We're here. We're free. We built something good. That counts for something." Eliza reached over and took his hand. "It counts for everything." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell completely, the stars bright and clear in the way they only were far from cities, far from the complications of civilization. Out here on the frontier, where systems broke down and raw human will mattered more than social structures, they'd proven something important. That courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about being terrified and fighting anyway. That strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up, again and again, until you finally won or died trying. And that change didn't come from heroes or perfect people. It came from flawed, scared, angry regular folks who decided they'd had enough and found others who felt the same way. Eliza Thorne had been sold into what was supposed to be a slow death on the frontier. Instead, she'd turned that frontier into a battlefield, fought systems designed to crush her, and helped build something better from the ruins. She'd never be perfect, would always carry scars from the fighting, would always remember the fear and desperation and impossible odds. But she'd also always know that she'd stood up when standing up mattered, that she'd refused to break when breaking was expected, that she'd proven power could be challenged, systems could be changed, and regular people could write their own endings instead of accepting the ones handed to them. And sitting on that porch, hand in hand with the man who'd become her partner in every sense, with their daughter sleeping safely inside, and a community of survivors turned fighters surrounding them, Eliza felt something she'd been chasing her whole life finally settle into place. Not happiness, exactly. Life was too complicated for simple happiness. But satisfaction. The deep bone-level knowledge that she'd lived fully, fought hard, and built something worth the cost. She'd been sold into servitude and had bought her own freedom. She'd been sent to die and had chosen to live fiercely instead. She'd been powerless and had seized enough power to matter. And she'd proven, beyond any doubt, that the frontier could be conquered, not by those with the most resources, but by those with the most courage. That was legacy enough for anyone. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of growing things and possibility, and Eliza smiled into the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The work was never done, the fighting never completely over. But tonight, she'd rest in the knowledge that they'd won something worth winning, and tomorrow they'd keep building on that victory. Together. Always together. That was how you survived the frontier, not by being the strongest or the richest or the most powerful, but by refusing to face it alone.